I just made our webinar live. I'm recording it.
All right, I guess we can go ahead and get started. Well, thank you everyone for being here. Good morning and welcome to the 5th Annual History Matters Conference at San Jacinto College. I'm Dr. Andrew Chow. I'm a professor of philosophy at our North Campus and a member of the organizing committee for today's event. We are proud to present a fantastic lineup of speakers on this year's theme, Celebrating a Century of Women's Suffrage, in honor of the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment and women's right to vote. Before we get started, I do want to say a few words about the history of History Matters. Our story begins back in 2016 when Professor John Gillespie had the idea of bringing together scholars from various fields to present a wide range of perspectives on important topics and themes in history. The inaugural History Matters Conference brought together educators with diverse backgrounds to examine and critique standardized testing through a historical lens. Encouraged by the enthusiasm of our speakers and participants, Professor Gillespie had a spark of ambition and thought, let's do this every year. So the next year, in 2017, we brought together scholars, again from a variety of disciplines, including history, philosophy, psychology, English, speech, and more, to engage with the topic of science and social justice. That year, we were glad to welcome a philosopher as our keynote speaker, Dr. Tyler Gibb from Western Michigan University. Then in 2018, we expanded History Matters and brought in, astoundingly, more than a dozen speakers with the topic of heroes and heroines, highlighted by keynote addresses from the Honorable Judge Phyllis Frye from the state of Texas and historian Dr. Wesley Phelps from Sam Houston State University. At our most recent event in 2019, our focus was on dimensions of freedom in 19th century America. And we were thrilled to have our keynote address given by Dr. Eric Foner from Columbia University. Thanks to the hard work of Professor Gillespie and our interdisciplinary organizing committees, History Matters has set a high bar over the last 5 years. And this year's event promises to be exemplary as well. We are honored to have the Chancellor of San Jacinto College, Dr. Brenda Hellier, begin our day with an introductory address to center us on this year's topic, Celebrating a Century of Women's Suffrage. Following Dr. Hellier's address, we will have 4 other presentations throughout the morning. So I want to give you an idea of our schedule. Starting at 9:15, Dr. Nancy Beck Young from the University of Houston will deliver her presentation titled Mr. E.R. Garner, Gender Passing and Work on Capitol Hill in the Post-Suffrage Era. At 9:45, Dr. Lisa Monday from St. Thomas University will speak about anti-militarism, militarism, and suffrage as a war measure. After the first 2 talks, we'll have a short 15-minute break. And then when we return at 10:30, Dr. Teresa Van Hoy from St. Mary's University will lead her interactive presentation titled Project Design for SJC's Suffrage Centennial Commemoration, a speed session. And finally, starting at 11 a.m., we are proud to welcome this year's keynote speaker, Dr. Kimberly Hamlin from the University of Miami, who will deliver her address, Free Thinker, Sex, Suffrage, and the Extraordinary Life of Helen Hamilton Garner. I want to extend a special thanks to all of our speakers for joining us under truly special circumstances this year. We originally planned our conference for late March, just after spring break, and then the world changed. So we are extremely lucky and grateful to our presenters for agreeing to a new date and format, and for all their help as we've planned and replanned the conference these last several months. Now, to begin the conference, it's my pleasure to provide an introduction for Dr. Brenda Hellier. In 2009, Dr. Hellier was appointed Chancellor of San Jacinto College, Texas' 8th largest community college with about 45,000 credit and non-credit students, 4 campuses, and several extension centers. The college also opened a 5th campus in August 2020. Prior to joining San Jacinto College, Dr. Hellier worked in the corporate world as an accountant in both the private and public arena. She holds a Bachelor's of Science degree in accounting from Fort Hays State University in Hays, Kansas, a master's degree in business administration from the University of Texas at Austin, and a doctorate degree in community college leadership from the University of Texas at Austin. Dr. Hellier is involved with various commissions, committees, and boards at the national, state, and local levels. and currently she serves as board chair of the Texas Association of Community Colleges. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Hellier. I'll go ahead and turn things over to you now.
Thank you, Andrew. And let me first welcome all of you to San Jacinto College. This is our Zoom campus. That was my best joke for the day. But it's been a really an interesting year. As Andrew mentioned, in March, when San Jacinto College decided to postpone the reopening of the college after spring break for a week, we did that in order for faculty to develop, adapt their classes for a virtual learning environment. We did it so that our staff could develop what did we need to do to best support our students in this virtual learning environment. And we thought we'd do this until the virus passed. Whoever would have thought we'd be in these altered operations for 8 months. And what an 8 months it's been. And so I show you some pictures of some of the things that have been happening on our campuses and with our students. And the one thing I want to do is tell you how creative and resilient our faculty, our staff, and our students have been. And I want to offer my compliments to the whole organizing committee of this conference to keep the History Matters 2020 conference going as a virtual dynamic is really incredibly important. You're celebrating the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage in this important election year. And again, I just thank you for moving this forward. And so as I was preparing remarks for your meeting today, it gave me the opportunity to think about what a tremendous opportunity and privilege being able to vote is. And the fact that my grandmothers were born in a society in which their voices didn't count at all continues to stun me. I sometimes forget that the women in their generation couldn't go to town on election day to vote for the city mayor, the state governor, or the president of the United States. And their thoughts literally didn't matter. I voted Saturday, and I was relieved and disappointed that there wasn't a line. I actually thought there should have been a line because I think this opportunity is so incredibly important for our country. I take voting seriously, and I always have. And so as I was preparing for today, I did reflect on this past 100 years, and I was led back to Carrie Chapman Catt, the founder of the League of Women Voters. And here's a quote that I found around her. And I could almost picture Carrie leading an army of women in 1919 to Washington, D.C. to pressure Congress to pass the constitutional amendment giving women the right to vote. And when you look at this quote, I underlined a phrase, suffered agony of soul. Isn't that powerful? When you think about what led to this opportunity and to this important and inherited political freedom. And so I thank you again for giving me the opportunity to talk and really think about this. And as you know, my job is community colleges. And so everything I do is around how do I tie community colleges into what I'm doing. And so today I have a great opportunity of being able to do that because the community college movement is very closely linked to the women's movement at various points of our community college history. Women earned the right to vote in 1920. And in that year, for the first time, the United States Commissioner of Education called together representatives of 34 educational institutions from across the country. And before I get into that 1920 meeting, I want to give you a little bit of history. In the mid to late 1800s, most two-year colleges were private institutions, and the people attending those institutions were mostly men. And men were attending, but it was a real burden for their families. And so community colleges, private community colleges, were created in populous rural areas in farming communities. Glenn College was created that way right here in Texas. In 1883, it was created as a place for the farmers to continue to have their young men work on the farm, so there wasn't an economic damage. but also to attend classes. And in many of those private community colleges, those two-year institutions, they were tied to a religious order. And so after attending the 2 years, they then went to Baylor University. And in 1901, the first community college was created in the country, Juliet Community College in Chicago. This again was came out of a public education era, and it was designed for men. So in that early 1900s into 1920, the growth of community colleges, technical colleges, junior colleges were all around enrollment of men. But there were also a need for normal schools. Prior to 1900, an 8th grade education was really considered adequate. But in the 1900s, it was decided that a high school education was needed. And there was a shortage of teachers. And so normal schools were created in order to train teachers. And about 60% of the enrollment at some of these normal schools in 1920 were women. So an opportunity for a career for women. And so now I go back to that 1920 called meeting of 34 educators by the United States Commissioner of Education. It was a forum of bringing together these junior colleges, these technical colleges, and these normal schools to decide on what was the next approach of how we were going to address the educational needs of the country, and specifically for women. And so the American Association of Community Colleges was formed in 1920. That association still operates today. It represents the nearly 1,200 community colleges in this country. And I'm going to be able to tell you a little bit more about why that's so important. The community colleges through the decades had different decades where there was tremendous growth. Right after World War II, the Truman Commission put together a veterans bill so that veterans coming home, again, mostly men from the war, were able to get their education. And then later in the 1960s into the mid 70s, there was tremendous growth in community colleges. That's when San Jacinto College was formed also. And it was our nation being in a social protest, the number of community colleges doubled. Many women who were married and had families right out of high school felt enlightened and empowered by the women's movement, and they returned to college. Community colleges were their opportunity. They were affordable, and they were in the communities so that they had options. And at that time, there was also growth in Hispanics and African Americans attending community colleges. And so today, across the country, there's 12 million community college students. Of those, 57% are women, and 29% of them are first generation to college. At San Jacinto College, this current fall, 61% of our enrollment are women. That's up, that grew 2% from last fall. And 62% of our students are Hispanic, and 48% are first generation college students. And so 1920 was an important year that came during a period of turbulence. There were racial tensions and riots in various parts of our country. The Great War had just ended. The country had recently survived a devastating pandemic, and the social change that the women's suffrage movement brought was disruptive. Like 1920 and 2020, we're viewing social justice matters differently. We're looking at race issues with a whole different view, a sharper and clearer lens, and really addressing issues that need to be addressed. We're grappling with the pandemic, and the social change is all around us. Great good came from the disruptions of 1920. And I hope and pray that positive change is going to come from what we're experiencing now in 2020. And you know, it would be easy for us to get depressed and down right now. But I do believe we're on a path to a brighter future for all of us. Our work in higher education and our students' pursuit of higher education and bringing light to darker places, encouraging the hopes and dreams of our students and the people in our community, and helping people find their voices. That's the role of higher education, and that's definitely the role of community colleges and San Jacinto College. I'm truly grateful for the women who fought for my right to vote and to have a voice in democracy. And in our country, I truly believe that we're seeing a whole new desire to fight for the rights of others right now. This is a quote from Abigail Scott Duniway. She died in 1915 prior to the 19th Amendment being enacted. But when you look at this quote, and it's a long one, what really stuck out to me is around the benefits that something that you have to fight for brings, requires the next generation to pay it forward for the future. And that is what I think you guys are doing today with this conference. You're bringing awareness to where the past has been, you're bringing issues to the table for the future, and you're paying it forward for our students, yourselves as educators, and I thank you for that. This is important work. Thank you for creating this conference. Thank you for your leadership. And I hope you have a great day today.
Okay, without any further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce the first speaker. My name is Doug Simmons, and I'm a history instructor at San Jacinto College, the Galena Park campus, or excuse me, the Generation Park campus. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Nancy Beck Young. She's going to give a talk today, and she is a history of 20th century American politics. Her research questions deal with issues that have shaped public policy and political institutions. Much of her work involves the study of Congress, the presidency, the electoral politics, first ladies. Dr. Young is also interested in Texas political history, especially Texas politics as it relates to issues in Washington. She joined the faculty of the University of Houston in 2007. And after teaching for 10 years, that was after she taught for 10 years at McKendree College in Illinois. She's held fellowships at the Clements Center for Southwest Studies at SMU and at Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, DC. Along with her colleague, Leandra Zarno, she was awarded funding for the National Endowment for the Humanities to host a 2017 summer seminar for college and university teachers entitled Gender and the State and the 1977 International Women's Year Conference. And so it is my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Nancy Beck Young.
Thank you very much for that warm welcome. And I am very happy to be here virtually. Well, I'm very happy to be with you. And I'm glad that we can do it virtually, but I really, really, really wish we were doing it on campus because, yeah, just because I think that takes care of it. So I am going to attempt to share my screen and show some slides. So bear with me a second as I work my way through that process. Okay. I only see me in the little boxes. Are any slides showing or not? They are showing? Okay, very good to know. Okay, so yes, it is working. Who was Mr. E.R. Garner? The answer, at least when it comes to Vice President John Nance Garner and the subject of my current research, is that there was no such person. The individual who worked in Garner's office who received mail addressed to Mr. E.R. Garner was none other than Mrs. Mariette Rheiner Garner, known in Washington, D.C. as Ettie R. Garner, and also the wife of the vice president. And here you can see a painting of Ettie Rheiner Garner as a young woman. Ettie Garner had long worked in her husband's office, dating back to his days in the Texas state legislature in the very early 20th century, almost 2 decades before women could vote, it is worth adding. She accompanied him to Washington, D.C. when he was first elected to Congress in 1902. And from the very beginning of his congressional career, she continued her practice of managing his office operations. When I first saw a letter addressed to Mr. E.R. Garner, I assumed a typo was the explanation, and I really didn't spend a lot of time thinking about it. But upon seeing that same typo in countless letters from countless archives, I decided that there had to be more to the situation than a simple dropped S on a typewriter. Moreover, Ettie Garner was not using the typical nomenclature for married women of her day. Etiquette from the early 20th century dictated that married women sign their correspondence in one of the 2 following ways. Mrs. John Nance Garner, completely removing her given name from the equation because women were viewed as property of fathers until they married and husbands after marriage. Or if she wished to be a bit radical, then Mrs. Ettie R. Garner, using her given name, or in her case, the abbreviation of it. Given these social mores, Ettie Garner's choice to sign her professional correspondence as E.R. Garner could not have been an accident. As such, I developed a theory that Ettie Garner was passing as male to gain greater respect while working in the very masculine environment of the US Capitol. Congressional staffs in the early 20th century looked nothing like what is common today. In the early 21st century, a freshman lawmaker might have 7 or 8 aides in Washington, D.C., and 4 or 5 more in their district office. Not true for the Garners 118 years ago. Unless a lawmaker was a committee chair or was in the congressional leadership, then members had only 1 or 2 employees total. And when the Garners first arrived in Washington, they didn't even necessarily have offices. They carried their work with them, literally. So committee chairs and those in leadership maybe had a couple more aides. In that era, it was not uncommon for lawmakers to hire adult children and spouses, and sometimes even mistresses to handle their office work. In fact, the Congressional Directory for the first several Congresses in which John Garner was a member made a point of noting whether or not a member had his wife with him in Washington, D.C. In too many of those cases, such employment decisions were mainly about familial revenue enhancement, but such was not the case for the Garners. And here you can see a picture of Ettie, and this is probably during the 1930s after Jack Garner was vice president, managing the mail. Ettie Garner worked very hard in her role, which was officially classified as secretary, not to be terribly surprising there. But more accurately, I think we would call her a chief of staff, a position that did not exist for lawmakers in the 1930s, but does reflect the multiple roles that Ettie played in Jack Garner's political career. These realities suggest why Ettie Garner might have tried to pass as male. She did not wish to be grouped with the grafters, but instead wished to show herself as a competent professional. Indeed, one journalist observed of Ettie Garner that she possessed, quote, a political acuity second to no man's in Washington. Finding her in the archival record then becomes the challenge, because wouldn't it be lovely if there was a nice cache of Ettie Garner papers, perhaps at the Briscoe Center at UT Austin or somewhere else, 10, 20, 50 boxes where I could read her letters, perhaps letters home to family members, et cetera, and I am indulging in a fantasy that will never be realized. More on that in just a second. It is not common to find papers for congressional spouses, certainly from the time period that the Garners were active. Some researchers can glean information about congressional spouses from the papers of their lawmaker husbands, but this is not an option for Ettie Garner either. Because after all, wouldn't it be lovely if there was a nice cache of 200, 400, 500 boxes of John Nance Garner papers? Ettie Garner is proving to be an even more ambiguous figure than her husband. The Garners are important individuals in modern American political history who have gone unappreciated for the simple reason that at a surface level examination, they are ciphers in the archives. There is no meaningful manuscript collection of John Nance Garner papers, and there are no Ettie R. Garner papers at all. The reason that there are but scant Garner papers in one archival collection is that Vice President Garner burned all of his papers. That will probably be the first sentence of my book whenever I get it written. So he burned all of his papers. He did this in the late 1940s after Ettie's death in a moment of grief. Ettie had been his most trusted advisor over the course of his long career in the House of Representatives as Speaker of the House in 1931 and 1932, and then as Vice President from 1933 through 1941. And he found it unbearable to keep the records that she had so professionally and lovingly maintained. This archival silence has created conditions where no previous scholar has attempted a biography of the Garners. My project, which I hope will be a dual biography, will remedy this problem. I'm using both traditional and new methods to recover the political history of this very important but unknown Washington, D.C. power couple before we even thought of Washington, D.C. power couples. The traditional methods involve archival research, but instead of having a core collection of papers on which to draw, I'm employing a massive travel strategy to collect all of the collections of Garner's allies and Garner's opponents. In that way, I am able to piece together the most significant John and Ettie Garner correspondence and to figure out how they worked in Washington, D.C. I've done enough of that work so far, trips to over 30 states plus the District of Columbia, to confirm that Ettie Garner, in addition to advising her husband on policy, played a significant role in maintaining his professional contacts. She did that work by managing his correspondence, as you can see again here. And it would not be a stretch to say that Ettie was Jack Garner's translator and sometimes voice, at least in his official correspondence. She prepared all but the most routine replies to letters that came to her husband. And by the time he was vice president, there were underling secretaries who took care of the congratulations for graduating from high school, sort of very basic letters. She knew what Jack Garner would want to say, and she wrote the replies for him. Where he was outwardly gruff, Ettie had a warmth and a grace that cemented the friendships that were integral to Jack Garner's political success. When Garner was first elected to Congress, there wasn't even a building for members of Congress to have offices. So she carved out office space in the K Street boarding house where they first lived. From there, she kept up with his correspondence and in the process learned the mores of national politics. She also benefited because she could combine her professional work as her husband's chief of staff with her household responsibilities as a mother to their young son. And she said it was possible because their son Tully was such an easy child, and power to them for having an easy child, just as an aside. Okay, this photo taken from the 1930s demonstrates Ettie's good humor with a member of the press. The scene for this photo is Ettie preparing to pack up the Garner office belongings for the return trip to Texas for the summer. And multiple journalists were in the vice president's office, as was normally the case. And Ettie picked up one of the cameraman's camera and took a picture of the journalist messing around with her baggage. What we can learn from this photograph is the convivial relationship that Ettie maintained with those people who were important to her husband's career. And this reveals not only her humanity in dealing with other human beings, but also her political wisdom in the importance of keeping up good relations with the press, the same press that would be covering her husband's career. And this digs into the new method that I am experimenting with in writing about the Garners. That new method involves an innovative reading of the massive photographic evidence of Jack and Ettie Garner in Washington, D.C., especially in the 1930s. For as much as Jack Garner did not like to speak publicly, in fact, he spent 8 years, think about this for a minute, 8 years in Congress before he gave a speech on the floor of the House of Representatives. He much preferred to work behind the scenes where no member of the public could really see what he was doing. Both he and Ettie were more than happy to pose for photographers, and I have literally come across a nice collection of hundreds and hundreds of photographs showing all sorts of views on Garner's, both Garners in Washington life. And so I am trying to read these photographs in a way that is perhaps not quite so typical for a political historian. For a typical political historian, photographs are the 6 or 8 or 10 things that you select and pay probably $100 an image for and put in the middle of the book to liven it up a bit. But I am going to attempt to use the photographs as text in much the same way as I would use letters, speeches, diary entries, and the like. So I think that what I'm going to try to do is give you a flavor of that. But before I go any further, I do want to roll back in time. We've moved into the 1930s, but I want to move back to the late 1890s and the 1900s to give you just a sense of background about Jack and Ettie Garner's marriage, because I would contend that they did not necessarily have a typical marriage. Jack Garner was born in Northeast Texas in 1868, but he moved to Uvalde as a young man in 1890 when it became obvious that he had no chance of a successful political career in the Texarkana region of the state. Once he relocated, Garner joined a local law firm and ran for county judge in 1893. His primary opponent in 1893 was none other than Ettie Rheiner, a young local woman who disapproved of Garner's poker playing and his outsider upstart challenge to the local entrenched power structure in the county. Rheiner made this challenge some 27 years before women gained the right to vote in federal elections and 25 years before women could vote in the Texas Democratic primary elections, which at that moment in time were the only elections that mattered in Texas. Rheiner lost, but the couple married 2 years later in 1895. So far, it sounds like Ettie Garner consistently challenged traditional gender roles, and in some ways, she certainly did. She did not, though, use her professional work as an argument that women as a class of people should be accorded similar opportunities. Instead, she advised other congressional spouses not to work in their husbands' offices. And here you can see, well, you saw a photograph of her as a young woman in 1905 that shows her privilege. And here you see her in the 1930s, where she appears more sensible and matronly in her keeping, but very much reflecting her social class and her political station. and showing the degree to which she attempted to blend in. Here is another image showing Garner displaying her sartorial flair and reflecting her elite status. And I would like to call attention to the fur stole that she is wearing around her neck. This was a very popular style for women of privilege in the 1930s. And this fur stole, I don't know whether these were minks or what other small animal volunteered his life for the benefit of Mrs. Garner's style choices. But these stoles came complete with the animal head, the eyes, and the feet intact. So a little off-putting in the 21st century, perhaps, but very stylish for that moment in time. This is also an important photo for showing more than Ettie Garner's elite fashion status. It shows Ettie as an equal to her husband returning to the US Capitol in December of 1933, and they are being greeted by Edwin Halsey, who was the Secretary of the Senate. And so I think that this photo is just as important for allowing us to see Ettie's equal standing in the political arena. Neither Ettie nor Jack Garner particularly enjoyed the social requirements of official Washington, viewing such affairs as fluff. And here you see a photograph showing their preferred evening activities at home, him smoking a cigar. Well, that was a preferred morning and afternoon activity for Jack Garner. So he did not relegate his cigars to the evening. And perhaps playing cards. There are other photographs of Ettie Garner knitting and Jack Garner reading, and keeping an early bedtime. The Garners were well known in Washington for not liking to go out and stay out late at night, but keeping to a very early bedtime. But they did acquiesce to what was required of them for their position. And here you see an image of the Garners entertaining the Roosevelts at the annual vice president's dinner for the president. And this is also an interesting photograph, just to point out. Franklin D. Roosevelt is standing with the support of a cane and a military aid. And without the cane, the military aid, and the 8 or 9 pound braces that are hidden by his trousers, he would not, of course, be standing at all. And here we see an image of Ettie preparing to host the Senate wives. It was custom for the vice president's wife to host the wives of the members of the US Senate once a year. I do not know what that food item is. It looks like it might be an ice sculpture. I can't really tell. If it's not an ice sculpture, I'm pretty sure I don't want to eat it. But this is interesting, showing her supervisory role over an official luncheon. Here, though, is a shot showing where Ettie was much more accustomed to working in the kitchen. And this is a photo of Ettie working in her kitchen in her Uvalde, Texas brick home. And it's also worth noting the fact that her hair is in some amount of disarray. And finally, it is worth noting that this is not a family photograph snapped by her son or her husband. This was an official photograph taken by a member of the press. And yet she posed in that way to show the multiple sides of herself. This photograph, and it is the next to the last one I have for you, is from one of Garner's US Capitol offices. I'm not sure whether this was when he was Speaker of the House or after he became Vice President, but it does reveal a key fact about the Garners and Ettie's multiple roles in her husband's career. The Garners were wealthy. They had become quite wealthy by this point in time and could have afforded whatever they needed or wanted. She kept a hot plate, which you can see here in the photograph, and a coffee percolator in the office to prepare their noontime meals on a daily basis. So she was his chief of staff, and she was also the office chef, although I think chef might be a bit of a stretch. I've heard that on that hot plate, mostly what she prepared was chili from a can or a can of beans, that sort of thing. The last photograph shows still other ways in which Jack and Ettie Garner bent their own preferences to the expectations of public service. Jack Garner was the first vice president to travel abroad in an official capacity while vice president. And Jack and Ettie Garner led a large contingent of Washington, D.C. officialdom on a trip to the Philippines in 1935. And here you see a photograph of Jack and Ettie. And if you know anything about Jack Garner, this photo is so out of kilter. Stopping in Hawaii and receiving 3, 4, 5 lays around his neck and 2 or 3 around her neck, with perhaps more to come. And I think that this photographic record put together shows that there was quite a bit more to Ettie Garner than passing as male, and quite a bit more to Ettie Garner than fulfilling traditional female roles. Ettie Garner had one foot in the traditional female expectation. She could host the Senate ladies for luncheon just as easily as she could mix it up with any member of the House or the Senate to help advance her husband's career. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Doug, I think you're still muted. So thank you, Dr. Young. Now you can take questions. You've got about 5 more minutes. So to the audience, you can type questions into the Q&A, or you can raise your hand and we can let you ask your question live if that's something that would be good.
And while people are thinking about questions, I see one question in the chat. Was she married to John or Jack? Apologies. John Nance Garner's name at birth was John Nance Garner, 3 words, and he went by Jack as a nickname. So apologies for confusing whomever I confused with the flipping back and forth between the multiple names. John and Jack are the same person in this story.
Well, while we're waiting on other questions, I'm curious, Dr. Young, just what it's been like to research this topic for you.
So, and I do see one question in the Q&A, and I can answer your question along with the question in the Q&A, which is, when do I foresee the book being completed? So I have really enjoyed the ordeal of the research. 30 states is a lot of travel, and I like traveling, so I suppose that would be why I have enjoyed it. I have enjoyed the challenge of trying to find someone who didn't want to be found. Before the Garner papers were burned, the archive at the University of Texas had courted the Garners to try to get their papers as a donation. And Ettie Garner wrote perhaps one of the most terse and cold letters I've seen from her, saying, "Thanks, but no thanks," was the message there. There just was not a tremendous amount of interest on the part of Garner's interest in saving his papers. So it has been challenging, but it helps that I've written a lot about Congress and I know where the collections are that I need to go. So I feel very fortunate in that regard. I have done probably 90% of the work I need to do outside of the state of Texas. I should have been much farther along because I had planned to spend the summer and fall of this year doing work in Texas, but yeah, we know how that one goes. I hope but you know, it depends upon things that are well beyond all of our control. And I would imagine it would take at least 2 or 3 years to write, given the manner in which I've come across the material. Organizing my findings is more than a little bit of a challenge. Other questions that I see in the chat. So John Nance Garner was FDR's first vice president, first of 3 vice presidents, elected with Franklin Roosevelt in 1932 and reelected in 1936. Garner, I am finding, was much, much more significant in the construction and passage of New Deal legislation than any account of the New Deal thus far acknowledges. And that's because Garner was so well known on Capitol Hill and could forge the compromises that were necessary to bring about Social Security, for example, banking reform, et cetera. One point that should be important to all of us, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, you know, you see that on the bottom of your checks. That's all thanks to John Nance Garner. Franklin Roosevelt was opposed to creating the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. Garner was not, and he made sure that it got into the legislation. So he was very important in that role. He and Roosevelt broke in the late 1930s, 1937, 38. A couple of factors caused the two of them to break. One was Franklin Roosevelt's interest in 1937 in expanding the size of the Supreme Court, something that we're hearing a lot about again today. And Jack Garner did not think that that was such a great idea. And so they argued a bit over that. And they also argued a bit more about the handling of the sit-down strike in Michigan in 1937, 1938. Garner was very opposed to the sit-down strike. And so that widened the breach between the two of them, so much so that Garner briefly challenged FDR for the Democratic nomination in 1940. That didn't go very far, but that's just how far apart the two men were by 1940. So what am I seeing here? What's the most surprising thing that I found in my research so far? Oh my, I would say the Mr. E.R. Garner. I think that was the most surprising thing. I knew that Ettie was his secretary, but seeing the way she presented herself publicly in that role was surprising. No member of Congress was fooled by the E.R. Garner ruse. That was, I think, for the benefit of executive branch folks who didn't necessarily know. So what else am I using? Another question I'm seeing here in the chat. Archives of friends and foes, photos. Yes, definitely newspapers. I am doing a tremendous amount of work in newspapers and in multiple ways. I'm the Briscoe Center for American History at the University of Texas at Austin has the newspaper morgue for the New York Times, and there is a very large Garner clip file in the New York Times morgue. For students out there who don't know what a newspaper morgue is, those are the internal files of a newspaper, and they can include just clippings from back issues filed by person and by subject, but they can also include reporters' notes and background information. It just depends as to what the practices were of any given morgue. And I'm still awaiting receipt of that file, so I don't know what I'm going to get. But I'm also using newspaper subscription databases, such as the historic newspapers from ProQuest. And I've got a subscription to newspapers.com, which provides me great material from small town newspapers that you would never find in a ProQuest historic newspapers database. I'm using memoirs written by other members of Congress, magazines that covered the Washington beat. I've found some what we would refer to as oral history interviews, transcripts that John Nance Garner sat for. He was very good friends with multiple members of the press. And one particular journalist interviewed him 3, 4, 5 times in the 1950s. Jack Garner lived a very long life after he left Washington, D.C. He did not die until 1967. He was 99 years old or almost 99 when he died. And his home in Uvalde was a go-to destination for the political luminary in the United States. And one journalist who he had known from his days in Washington, D.C., convinced him to sit down for a series of interviews. And I have the transcripts of those interviews, all of them.
Dr.
copied.
Young,
Yes.
this has been very interesting and I really have enjoyed your presentation. But unfortunately, we have another
Time.
Yeah, so, but it's been very special and we really appreciate your knowledge that you bring to this. But at this point, I think we're going to have to move on to the second presenter. But once again, thank you very much.
Thank you. And thank you for stopping me.
No, that's
Okay, yes, thank you, Dr. Beck Young, for your presentation. My name is John Gillespie, and I teach history and English and humanities at San Jacinto College North. And it is my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Lisa Monday. Dr. Monday is Associate Professor and Chair of the History Department at the University of St. Thomas here in Houston. Her field of expertise is U.S. military history, particularly the Cold War era and the U.S. war in Afghanistan. She's contributed a chapter on the combatants' experiences in understanding U.S. wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and the Bilko bombers, anti-militarism in the age of the new look in living room wars, American militarism on the small screen, as well as publishing American Militarism and Anti-Militarism in Popular Media, 1945 to 1970. Dr. Monday's current project is tentatively titled Forgotten, the Service Member Experience in the U.S. War in Afghanistan, 2001 to 2014. The title of her presentation today is Anti-Militarism, Militarism, and Suffrage as a War Measure. So I will now turn it over to Dr. Monday.
Thank you, John, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you, students, for coming. I'm happy to be invited to this. And without further ado, let's get into anti-militarism, militarism as a war measure. Okay. Until recently, Americans had traditionally and sincerely viewed themselves as a peaceful, unmilitaristic people. Yet the U.S. has been involved in many wars, and war has been used as a justification for numerous policy, economic, and societal changes. Indeed, the passage of a federal women's suffrage amendment became intrinsically tied to World War I, presented by the suffragists and the president as a war measure. As the nation became swept up in the militarism associated with waging war, President Woodrow Wilson and the suffragists of the National American Women's Suffrage Association claimed that women's participation in the war effort ought to result in the franchise. Other suffragists, largely tied to Alice Paul and the National Women's Party, remained staunchly anti-war, which threatened to taint the cause in the eyes of many Americans who had become influenced by the militarist tide of wartime America. While militarism was certainly not the only or even the decisive factor that won suffrage for American women, the suffragists of the National American and President Wilson certainly believed presenting suffrage as a war measure would sway senators and male voters in the states. Before we get into any of the details, we need to look at a couple of definitions. What exactly is militarism? It is a system of framing, valuing, and ranking the military above civilian life. In militarist societies, war, or the preparation for war, dominates politics and foreign policy, and the military takes priority in national resources. For us looking at the women's suffrage movement, we are interested in the cultural values that accompany militarism. Militarist nations value obedience, duty, and collective sacrifice. It is the particular values of duty and collective sacrifice that underpinned the argument for suffrage as a war measure. Out of patriotic duty, women sacrificed their time, energy, money, work, and even their sons to the war effort. Consequently, they deserve the franchise. Outside of wartime, America had traditionally been an anti-militaristic society, one that places civilians firmly in charge of the government and the military. Anti-militarists do accept war as sometimes necessary, so they are not pacifists who, of course, oppose all war on principle. Thanks to the inherent militarism of wartime, anti-militarist and anti-war sentiments proved detrimental to the suffrage cause. Carrie Chapman Catt particularly wanted to protect the suffrage movement, principally her organization, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, from the taint of pacifism that hung over the National Women's Party during the war. World War I split the suffrage movement. During the 1916 presidential election, the National American insisted on staying away from the war issue to focus solely on suffrage, while the National Women's Party hosted a number of pacifists opposed to the war. Catt joined most Americans in siding with the more democratic British. But more important was her belief American women could win the vote by supporting the war. To her, and to most National American members, the war offered a unique opportunity to demonstrate that no major governmental policy could be effective without women's support, and that women's participation in the war effort should entitle them to the vote. Meanwhile, the more pacifist Women's Party began to picket Wilson and then marched in front of the White House, starting in January 1917. Initially, their right to free speech was respected, but after the U.S. entered the war, administration security officials began to see the women as enemies and a potential threat to the president's life. In June, the police began arresting them for obstructing the traffic, and during the next 6 months, over 200 of them were arrested. Suffragette and Congresswoman Jeanette Rankin's vote against U.S. entry into the war further associated pacifism with the suffrage movement. In his war message to Congress, President Wilson accepted the growth of militarism to wage the war. Indeed, as one observer noted, it would take militarism to defeat militarism. Wilson explained to the American people, it will involve the organization and mobilization of all the material resources of the country to supply the materials of war and serve the incidental needs of the nation. It will involve the immediate full equipment of the Navy. It will involve the immediate addition to the armed forces of at least 500,000 men, who should, in my opinion, be chosen upon the principle of universal liability to service. Here, Wilson rejects the anti-militarist tradition of calling for volunteers for military service and embraces the militarist policy of conscription. From this request, the Selective Service Act became law in May 1917. It allowed the president to increase the regulars, call up the National Guard, and raise by selective service draft an army of 1 million men. All men ages 18 to 45 had to register for service. Many Americans felt impelled to support their country during the time of need and willingly fell into patriotic support for the war effort. The Women's Journal, now named Woman's Citizen, declared that no jockeying with the pacifist past can save the world now. War is here. The National American vigorously adapted itself to the organizational opportunities of wartime. In doing so, the suffragists supported the growing militarism of wartime society. Some suffragists took leadership positions in the war effort. Anna Howard Shaw was chairwoman of the Women's Committee of the Council of National Defense, which organized women for war work. Catt joined the same committee. Many other suffrage leaders used the war to demonstrate their desire for full participation in democracy. Daisy Harriman, for example, chaired the government's Committee on Women in Industry and helped create the Red Cross Motor Corps, which sponsored 500 female ambulance drivers in Europe. More than 1,000 women went to Europe as contract employees of the Army, where they worked as translators and telephone operators. More than 40,000 joined the Army Nurse Corps or the Red Cross. The Navy and the Marines enlisted an additional 13,000 women. Civilian women worked in munitions plants and replaced men in unconventional jobs, such as driving streetcars. Virtually millions donated their time and money to the Red Cross, Salvation Army, YWCA, and other relief agencies. Virtually all women responded positively to major government programs that exhorted them to conserve food and fuel for the front. It was time to turn women's participation in the war effort to advance the cause. Catt declared, "If the Congress intended that women be enthusiastic supporters of the war, then Congress must demonstrate its respect for women." Okay, so now I'm going to try to share my screen so I can show you a political cartoon, and let us see if this works. Can you all see my political cartoon? Hopefully, yes. All right, excellent. All right, so this was published in the Brooklyn Magazine in November 1917. And you can see that the argument is pretty much summed up pretty well here. We've got Uncle Sam, of course, the United States, representing public opinion. And we have American womanhood over here represented in the nurse. And of course, the idea here is if you are good enough for war, you are good enough to vote. Addresses at the National American Convention in 1917 confirmed the conscious association of war support and suffrage. Shaw deliberately cast women's home front activities in militarist terms. She stated, "Unless the army at home does its duty faithfully, the army in the field will be unable to carry to a victorious end this war." She further connected women's war work with citizenship and the franchise by declaring, "The great war that shall bring to the world the thing that is nearest our hearts, democracy, that those who submit to authority shall have a voice in the government, and that when they have that voice, peace shall reign among the nations of men." Suffragists in other nations successfully used the war to advance their cause. As the National American acknowledged at its convention, "Every allied nation has announced that it is fighting for this, and our president has declared that we are fighting for democracy, for the right of those who submit to authority to have a voice in their government. Now Russia has answered the call. Great Britain has pledged full suffrage for women, and the measure has already passed the House of Commons by an enormous majority of 7-1. Canada, too, has responded with 5 newly enfranchised provinces. France is waiting only to drive the foe from her soil to give her women political liberty. Our government must be made to realize also that, willingly as women are now serving, they can serve still more efficiently when they shall have received the full measure of citizenship." Yet not all suffragists were on board. The National Women's Party persisted in picketing the White House, and some members continued to protest the war. Alice Paul and her supporters burned the president in effigy in the summer of 1917. Thereafter, the media associated the Women's Party with the National American, casting all suffragists as disloyal. Nevertheless, the women came out in September 1917 to protest the draft. In this picture, we can see National Women Party picketer Dorothy Bartlett standing next to a banner, which reads, "Mr. President, it is unjust to deny women a voice in their government when the government is conscripting their sons." Bartlett became one of 13 women arrested and sentenced to 60 days in the workhouse for her protests against the draft. These activities succeeded to entangle the suffrage movement with the relatively small numbers of dissidents who continued to oppose the war and conscription, who became engulfed in a wave of popular hysteria and official suppression. With the passage of the Espionage and Sedition Acts, the federal government's aggressive prosecution of them and the support of the courts, open opposition to the war thus became impossible. While the National Women's Party protested the war and the draft, the National American and state suffrage associations continued to promote statewide voting initiatives, as well as a federal amendment to the Constitution. The New York State Women's Suffrage Party seized on the argument of suffrage as a war measure to influence men in the state at the next election. To assist their efforts, President Wilson met with a delegation of New York suffragists to focus political attention on the contributions that women were making to win the war. The New York women published a leaflet in October 1917 explaining exactly how women's suffrage was a war measure. They declared, "Since the war began, women's suffrage has been sweeping over the civilized world. In every country at war, the vote has either been given to women or is under consideration." They ask, "Are New York women going to be classed as the only women among civilized nations unworthy of the vote?" Men have denied votes to women because they said that women are not called to serve the state and therefore not entitled to vote. This war has proved that women must serve the state equally with men. Here, the state party intimated the connection between democracy, citizenship, and the vote. Equality of effort met the home front. They wrote, "Give votes to women as part of the nation's defense. Government is calling women to help in factories, in the production and conservation of food, to make munitions, and hardest of all, to give their sons to war. Women are responding to the call. They are eager to serve. Either in war or in peace, they wish to serve their country." In these words, we can hear the echo of the militarist values of duty and collective sacrifice. The New York Women's Suffrage Party's 2-year campaign proved successful. In November 1917, New York men enfranchised their women by a narrow margin, thus becoming the first Eastern state to fully enfranchise women. The same year, legislatures in Ohio, Indiana, Rhode Island, Nebraska, and Michigan enacted presidential suffrage, and Arkansas granted suffrage in party primaries. With the momentum of state victory, Cat, Shaw, and the women of the National American did everything in their power to distance themselves from the Women's Party and demonstrate their patriotic war service for the upcoming 1918 congressional elections. They also convinced President Wilson to adopt suffrage as a war measure. On January 9, 1918, he issued a formal statement supporting the federal amendment. The day after Wilson's formal request, Jeannette Rankin opened debate in the House on a new suffrage amendment. The 274 to 136 tally was exactly the requisite number for the constitutional requirement of 2/3 majority. The women had successfully overcome one hurdle. The Senate, which had been the most supportive body for decades, now turned against the women. Senate leaders refused to take a vote. Finally, in late August, the Senate took up the issue. The women again appealed to President Wilson. Writing to the president in June 1918, Elizabeth Merrill Bass urged him to make a public declaration. She wrote, "I believe, Mr. President, that the time has come for you to take the final step in making a public proclamation, or by going to the Senate and placing before them the necessity of making this a war measure. You, more than anyone else in the world, are the voice of the world, and I believe you can make them see that they need the women of this country, not only in the work of the war, but in the work of rebuilding civilization." Here she touched on the now common theme connecting wartime service with citizenship and voting. She even suggested the president approach certain senators with the argument of suffrage as a war measure. Bass noted that Senator Guyon of Louisiana is reported to say that if it is put to him by you as a war measure, he will vote for it. Suffragists certainly believed the war measure argument would prove successful in swaying the votes their way. Cat also wrote to the president to use his influence to convince the Senate that suffrage was a war measure. Several senators on the floor and in conversation have said they could not see that women's suffrage is in any sense a war measure, Cat explained. So she urged Wilson to respond directly to them. She also related an anecdote to the president. We have many war workers in our house, and last night I asked a young woman who for patriotic reasons has been working in the Ordnance Department why women's suffrage should be called a war measure. She promptly replied, because it is an incentive to better and more work. It suggests that as active as women had been to support the war effort, with the addition of voting rights, women would collectively sacrifice even more to fulfill their duty and obligation as patriotic citizens. On September 30th, 1918, Wilson took the unprecedented step of speaking to the Senate in person on the issue. In his address to the Senate, Wilson tied the militarism of wartime support with the notion of full citizenship and the franchise. He linked victory in the war with women's participation and noted the expanding franchise in the nation's allies. He exhorted, I regard the extension of suffrage to women as vitally essential to the successful prosecution of the great war of humanity in which we are engaged. And its adoption is, in my judgment, clearly necessary to the successful prosecution of the war and the successful realization of the objects for which the war is being fought. We have made partners of the women in this war. Shall we admit them only to a partnership of suffering and sacrifice and toil, and not to a partnership of privilege and right? This war could not have been fought if it had not been for the services of women, services rendered in every sphere. It is now certain that the other great free nations will enfranchise them. The tasks of the women lie at the very heart of the war. Show our women that you trust them as much as you in fact and out of necessity depend upon them. I tell you plainly that this measure which I urge upon you is vital to the winning of the war and to the energies alike of preparation and of battle. Here the president argues that the war could not be conducted without the duty and sacrifice of the women's efforts, militarist values, if you recall. He urges the Senate to reward that duty and sacrifice with voting rights. Unfortunately for the suffragists, not even the president's address could sway enough senators to pass the federal amendment at that time. The vote was 62 to 34, too short of the two-thirds requirement. Now, even the National Women's Party was quite willing to adopt militarist imagery in their suffrage campaign. Nina Allender's sketched this cartoon about the last 2 Senate votes needed, depicting a suffragist as a soldier advancing on the Senate's trench line. Militarism both helped and hindered the 1918 congressional elections, which left Republicans in control of both chambers of Congress. Republicans won 25 seats in the House and 5 seats in the Senate. On the one hand, Republican victory came through criticizing the militarist expansion of the wartime government under Wilson. On the other hand, Jeannette Rankin lost her seat because of her anti-war stance. Pacifism proved more detrimental than militarism for most voters. The suffragists of the National American continued to stress the theme of suffrage as a war measure at their March 1919 National Convention. The women praised the militarist values of duty and sacrifice by noting the magnificent way in which women had met the demands of war, their patriotic service, their loyalty to the government. They celebrated the enfranchisement of women in Britain and Canada and observed the nations of Europe that had overthrown emperors and kings gave women equal voting rights with men. The U.S. Senate was still holding out by a majority of 2 against submitting the federal amendment. Every officer of the association worked in some sort of war service, and at its end, both Carrie Chapman Catt and Anna Howard Shaw received the Distinguished Service Medal, the highest civilian honor for their wartime service. On May 21, 1919, the House took its final vote on the 19th Amendment, which it approved by an overwhelming 304-90 majority. Although they thought they had the votes, suffragists nonetheless worked and worried ceaselessly until the Senate voted the following June. After the final Senate vote was tallied, the result was 66-30 in favor of the federal amendment, 2 votes over the necessary 2/3. As Doris Weatherford noted, by careful political strategy and endless public persuasion, the National American Women had turned their 2-vote loss in 1917 into a 2-vote victory in 1919. A consistent theme of that campaign had been suffrage as a war measure, to reward women for their duty and collective sacrifice to the war and win the franchise. The final hurdle for suffrage was the ratification of the federal amendment by 36 of the 48 states at the time. Catt understood that the states' ratification needed to happen before the wave of enthusiasm dissipated. Weatherford notes, she was enough of a student of history to understand that a period of conservatism almost inevitably follows soon after any war, and that she must move quickly before the wartime spirit of cooperation began to be forgotten. On June 10, 1919, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin became the first 3 states to ratify the amendment. Texas became the first southern state to ratify on June 26. By the end of 1919, 22 states had ratified, pushing the campaign into 1920. Tennessee, of course, became the 36th state to ratify in August of 1920. With the ratification of the 19th Amendment, the United States became the 27th country to give women the right to vote. The ironically liberating effect of war was clear in other nations as well. By the end of the war, women had gained the vote in Austria, Canada, Ireland, Poland, and the United Kingdom. The next year, Germany, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands followed. As some historians have argued, the final victory of women's suffrage in the United States was due both to effective national leadership of the suffrage forces and to favorable historical circumstances. Woodrow Wilson's grudging support, the tone of his administration's domestic and foreign policies, and above all, World War I provided Catt and her colleagues with the opportunity the National American had heretofore lacked. For American women, militarist values of duty and sacrifice for the war effort became a rallying cry for the extension of suffrage as a war measure. It was taken up by the suffrage of the National American, by state suffrage organizations, and by President Wilson. They believed the argument of suffrage as a war measure would sway men to vote in favor of women's voting rights, which did indeed happen in New York, in the House of Representatives, and the US Senate. Of course, women's war work during the First World War largely happened on the home front, or in more traditional women's jobs such as nursing. The roles of women in war, acting as full citizens, has expanded over time, but not without controversy. For men, the idea of military duty has often been tied to citizenship. In colonial America, there was universal military obligation for every military-aged man to serve, an idea that underpins the Selective Service Acts that created the draft in the 20th century. Immigrants and African Americans have argued their wartime service earned them citizenship and civil rights. Only recently, with the US wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, have we considered the role of women as serving in combat in defense of the nation as well. In both Iraq and Afghanistan, the US faced insurgencies where enemy combatants hid within the civilian population and fought without clear front lines. On January 24, 2013, the Department of Defense lifted the restrictions against women serving in frontline combat units, responding to the reality that without defined front lines, women had been serving in combat for over 12 years already. Once women could serve on the front lines, then why not in the combat arms as well? In December 2015, Secretary of Defense Ashton Carter opened all combat jobs to women. Now women can both vote and serve their country in combat during times of war. What would Carrie Chapman Catt and Alice Paul think of that? Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation, Dr. Monday. At this time, we can open up the chat box to some questions, or if you're comfortable raising your hand virtually, then we can hear your voices and manage as we did before.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So I see that there's one question already, wondering if that suffrage as a war measure had not occurred, how do we believe women's suffrage would have alternately developed during these times? Now, this is a fascinating question, right? Because ever since Abigail Adams, women have been trying to make the argument that political equality for women meant the right to vote. And men had consistently rejected that argument. They rejected that argument when Stanton and Susan B. Anthony tried to make that in the Declaration of Sentiments in 1848. It just was not persuasive. And so it does seem that the participation of women in what had become the first kind of total war event of this worldwide conflict did seem to put pressure on the sense that women could act publicly in a role, and that public role should, in fact, end with some sort of political participation in the form of voting rights. And it's interesting to me that this was a worldwide phenomenon. It was not just here in the United States that this was happening, but there were suffrage movements in other European nations, in Central and South America as well. And it's just fascinating how that the war ended up being the catalyst that kind of spurred these the success worldwide. So I'm not entirely sure when women would have gotten the right to vote if not for that, if not for those particular historical circumstances.
Somebody has raised their hand, so I'm looking. Okay. Okay, so okay, the hand raiser. You can now speak, I believe.
Hi, Dr. Monday. Can you hear me?
Yes. Hi, Harpreet. How are you doing?
Good. Hi, good morning. So I have two short questions. Well, one statement and one question. And I'm so glad you mentioned how the vote of the suffrage affected worldwide. And during the same time, around 1920 and 1915, there was a whole movement going on in India where the women were granted the right to vote around 1920. So the American suffragist movement actually inspired a lot of the groups in India. So I'm so glad you brought that up. The second question is not that academic, but I wanted you, if you could explain the significance of the color purple and gold, and the women's, they used it on their flags and pins. So I've never really ventured out into why they use that colors, and maybe you could explain a little bit. And I loved your presentation, by the way. So.
Oh, thank you. I don't know about the color scheme, actually. And in fact, if some of our other panelists can actually answer the color question, I would appreciate it. If anyone can jump in there. Okay. So nobody's quite sure about the color question, but that's definitely something that I could look up and I could get back to everybody on later. I do see there's another question in the chat box about, with a nod to our present day Senator Tammy Duckworth, MJ Hagar, and Amy McGrath running for Senate. Were there any American women who served overseas in World War I who are noted for coming back and running for office or becoming active in suffrage? I'm not entirely sure of the ones. I'm not entirely sure if anyone ran for office afterwards. I mean, certainly suffragists were important in the home front war efforts. And because of time constraints, I wasn't even able to go into the women's suffrage movement's ties to the Anti-Militarist League and to some of the pre-war peace measures and peace movement in trying to end the war before U.S. involvement started. So I definitely know they were active before. I'm not entirely sure how many came back and ran for office afterwards, but that's a great question. And I'm actually interested in looking up the answer myself. Let's see. Do you feel that having the president in favor helped out tremendously? And also, do you feel the National Women's Party not being on the same page hindered the progress in any way? Well, absolutely, yes. I absolutely believe that Wilson's support for suffrage did help tremendously. And yes, I do think that the women at the time perceived that the anti-militarism and the pacifism of the National Women's Party was detrimental because they were making such a strong case for them serving their country patriotically with duty and sacrifice, and that duty and sacrifice required the result being the franchise. And so definitely Kat believed that what was going on with the draft protest was detrimental to the suffrage movement. Okay, and Brett Nelson, yes, purple was the color of loyalty, gold the color of light and life as the torch that guided their purpose. Awesome, thank you so much for answering that question. Yes, great. Love it. Collective wisdom, all right.
All right. At this point, I think what we're going to do is take a 5-minute break in the program to let everybody stretch their legs and take care of whatever business they need to. Thank you, Dr. Monday, for your presentation. Thank you for appearing virtually. And Brett Nelson, thanks for answering the question. Brett is one of our colleagues at the Central Campus, I believe. So we're going to do a 5-minute break, and we will be back with Dr. Teresa Van Hoy, and then our keynote speaker, Dr. Kimberly Hamlin. So I'll see you all in 5 minutes.
Okay, so welcome back after our break. My name is Professor Holly Mulholland, and I teach government at San Jacinto's North Campus. And I'd like to welcome next Dr. Van Oy. Dr. Van Oy is a professor of history at St. Mary's University and also the former chair of women's studies there. As a traditional scholar, Van Oy's work has focused on gender and war. And during her tenure as O'Connor Chair for the History of Hispanic Texas and the Southwest, she's analyzed the role of Mexican Americans in defending twin republics, Mexico and the United States in the mid-19th century. That research has been presented at conferences and workshops from Texas to Harvard to Mexico City and resulted in an article published in a journal in Spain. Her current book, manuscripture, is titled Cinco de Mayo and Civil War in the Borderlands. Dr. Van Oy is founder of the Public History program at St. Mary's University. Van Oy engages students in a master initiative that they have dubbed Taking History to the Streets and Squares from the Rio Grande to the Rhone. Her current project seeks to win official recognition for German American and German Latin American internment during World War II. So if we could please welcome Dr. Van Oy.
Good morning, everybody. I am so happy to be back at San Jac. I want you to know that when I was teaching at UHCL, my best students were from San Jac. So I feel a deep connection and a huge gratitude to the fantastic job that the history department has always done. I'm attesting back to 2000. You guys make great history majors, and the rest of us benefit. So in fact, I gave you a gift back. I just want you to know, I gave you guys a gift back. I gave you perhaps my best student ever, and that is Professor Danielle Bible. So just saying, you kind of owe me too. We're kind of even now. So, okay, so here we are back at San Jac, and we know we have brilliant students, and we know we have fantastic colleagues. Now what, right? We've been learning all of this great stuff this morning. You're hearing about Ettie Garner of Texas. You saw her in her kitchen in Uvalde. You hear Dr. Monday's analysis also of militarism, anti-militarism, and suffrage. You saw that the suffragists, in her presentation, you saw the suffragists were making cartoons to win the vote. So what that tells you right there is that suffragists were doing public history projects. They were sewing stars on a flag. You saw that in the presentation this morning. Number 36, Alice Paul sewing that star to dramatize the historic moment and to pressure for justice. Fantastic. So now what do? As you heard Dr. Hellier say, we got to pay it forward. Our debt to the past, we must pay forward. And so you guys are already off to a fantastic start. You're doing the research. You're teaching the curriculum. You're organizing conferences. You're even reorganizing conferences once COVID tried to defeat you and you were indefatigable. Hats off to Andrea and John on that one. You're learning from our scholars this morning. But so far, my students, I'm speaking to the students here, because we got what, 96, don't leave. 96 we got out there. So now the ball has been tossed in your court, because if you don't take that ball and pay it forward, then you remain in a passive role. So the question is, how does it become yours? Right now it belongs to Dr. Monday, and it belongs to Dr. Gillespie, and it belongs to Dr. Chow, belongs to Dr. Beck Young, belongs to Chancellor. But what about you? So now I'm asking you, in fact, let me tell you, my students here at St. Mary's University are throwing down a challenge. And the rest of my short presentation today is getting you up and ready so that you can win our challenge. Stiff competition because my kids got a head start, but here it is. By June 26th, 2021, St. Mary's history students challenge San Jac history students to produce nine publications or otherwise publicizing your own research on the centennial of suffrage, on the suffrage. Okay, 9 of you. Why 9? Because we were number 9. Texas was number 9 on June 26th, signing the ratifying the amendment. Now, we were also first in Texas. That makes us leaders in Texas. So I want you to join my students in being leaders in Texas and leaders in the South and leaders in the US, getting young people's voices out, getting young people's historical analyses, historical research out to the public. Now, that sounds impossible because I'm hearing you groan. I'm in Chicago. I can hear you groan in Houston all the way up here to Chicago. That's why I'm moving around so much today. I can't find the best spot in my son's house here.
Dr. Van Noy, if I could interject, I just want to let the students know that we have, per your request, activated the chat. So for
Hot dog, let's hear it. Hit
for those
me up.
students who are interested in commenting or asking questions directly to Dr. Van Noy.
Yeah, or criticizing my hairdo or whatever. I got range. So you can just speak because it's all about hearing your voices. So you put that stuff in the chat and we'll get our game going here. So okay, so here is Van Hoy up here saying, okay, look, everybody wants to hear your voice. And I'm giving you till June to get it out there. And the first thing you're saying down there in Houston is, who's going to want to hear our history project? Who's going to want to hear anything about history? Who's going to hear anything from an 18-year-old or a 19-year-old, 20? Everybody. You don't even have to be a history major to get your voice heard. So if I were as cool as my colleagues, I could share my screen right quick. I'm going to be back. So I don't have a PowerPoint. But I'm going to share something with you just so you can believe me here. Oh, dang. Allow Zoom to share your screen? Oh, never mind. All right, never mind. Okay, plan B. I'm not sharing my screen. You Google me. Google Teresa Van Hoy. You're on a computer too, right? So just Google Teresa Van Hoy, Wall Street Journal. I'm looking at you to see if you're doing it. I can tell all the way from Chicago if you're compliant. Teresa Van Hoy, Wall Street Journal. And you're going to pull up an article that appeared, ladies and gentlemen, above the fold on November 6th, I think it was, but you can double check. It'll say there, November 6th, 2016. And ignore the Teresa Van Hoy part and scroll down. In fact, look, I can pull it up because I already had it up on my own screen here. It's at the War of Santana's leg. And you scroll down to the picture of the cartoon image of the leg there. Will Connors, November 6, 2016. And there's a picture of the leg and it says, said Andre, right beside it to the right, it says, said Andre Grajeda, a 19-year-old sophomore history major at St. Mary's University, San Antonio. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, November 6th, 2016, this is the Wall Street Journal. This is the front page of the Wall Street Journal, above the fold. And they're talking about a 19-year-old history major at a rinky-dink college in Texas. That's what, 2 days before the presidential election. You'd think that Wall Street Journal has something else to talk about, right? Besides some 19-year-old history kid on a history field trip with some old professor. No, Wall Street Journal cared. And that's not all. My students are the only ones in the United States of America. If you go to my YouTube channel, if you go to YouTube and you punch in Cleo in color, you'll see that my students have made many videos. And if you go to the World War I collection, you'll see that some of those videos have 2,000-3,000 hits. But they bear the logo, the official logo of the Federal World War I Centennial Commission in Washington, D.C., appointed, a 12-person commission appointed by former President Obama. We have, my students, my 18-year-olds have their logo on our film because they gave us a licensing agreement because the kids were producing such great films, in their homes. 5 minutes getting history out to the public. And the Centennial Commission said, hey, we want that right there. And so they linked it up all over the country to their own personal Texas World War I Centennial Commission, North Dakota World War I Centennial Commission. So in addition to the hits you see on my YouTube channel, some people have linked it straight into their military museum. And those hits also are proof that my students' voices are being heard. Okay, so it's not all about my students. Today we have we're going to launch your project. I just wanted to convince you that you don't have to be a professor. You don't have to have a PhD. You don't have to, be old and smart and seasoned. You just do your research, conceive of a project, and throw that thing out there. The last thing I'll mention is that a filmmaker in Boston heard about that project, the one about Santana's leg, which, by the way, he still had when he was defeated at San Jacinto. Let me just say, he still had that leg on him. I mean, it was a real leg at the time, 36. So a filmmaker in Boston heard we were doing this crazy thing, and she said, hey, I'll make a film about it. I said, I don't know if this is real trailer sizzle. A history professor and a bunch of kids. She said, no, I'm making the film. Well, she made the film, and you can Google 25 Texans. In fact, I'll put it in the chat. Watch this. Oh, I don't have the whole chat here. I have only the panelist chat, I think. I don't think I can. Oh, and attendees. Okay. So if you Google 25texans.org, you'll meet Andre Garajeda, and you'll meet me on that field trip that got covered by the Wall Street Journal. Well, that film, ladies and gentlemen, went on to win awards all over the United States and in Mexico. So if you lose heart and you think nobody wants to hear my voice, nobody wants to see my analysis, just watch that trailer again. It's also on Canopy, so you can catch it on Canopy if you want to see the whole thing. All right, so what about Sanjak students? I've already given you a few ideas, right? Videos, little individual videos that students can make on suffrage, the centennial as well. My students decided to brainstorm some ideas for you, but I'm going to save their ideas in case you guys don't have any. Like if you just don't have any ideas, I'll tell you what my students are proposing for you. I'll give you only one of their ideas for you, just to kind of start you thinking. My students said, hey, why doesn't Sanjak tell City Council in Houston to host a celebration on June 26th, or maybe the Sanjak kids could tell Austin state legislature to host a celebration on June 26th, 2021, commemorating the 101st anniversary of Texas's ratification of women's suffrage. Something like that. Send a proposal, write your congressman or woman, So that's my students' idea for what y'all could do. And they said, hey, we'll do it with them if they want. If you invite my students, they'll do it with you. So we can team up. My history club can work with your history club. Okay, so let's start it. Let me hear what your ideas. The thing is, let me see if I can see everybody. Somebody say something. Am I getting anything in here? Oh yeah, there we go. Holly's talking already about Greta Thunberg, the 17-year-old activist from Sweden. And let's see that we have some kids here. Oh yeah, Haley. Oh, Haley, thank you, thank you. She's posting the actual link. Okay, so I can hear you. What's your idea? What can we do? We got 5 minutes and we want to get 30 ideas. So start peppering the chat, or and then I'll look at the chat, or you can just raise your hand and Holly will let you speak. She'll unmute you. Don't make me tell my students y'all didn't have any ideas now. That's gonna be sad. When does my presentation end? Because I do have an idea in case we get no ideas. Holly, what time does my presentation end?
Well, you have another 12 minutes here, so.
Okay, so 12 minutes. All right, so I'm going to 11 o'clock. So at 10:55, I'm gonna give you an idea that I think will work. Oh, here's one. Haley's on fire. Thanks, Haley. I'm just glad you guys have a pulse out there. Write our Congress about equal pay to women at our current time. Yeah, while we're at it, like, let's celebrate that centennial and say, we got the vote. Now we need, we got the equal suffrage. Now we need equal pay. I like the way you're thinking. That's a brilliant idea. We'll write them with you. Oh, there's a hand up. So I can't see the students, unfortunately. So somebody else will have to click. All I see are my beautiful co-panelists here. Oh, S. Weaver, go ahead.
Good morning. I thought, since Texas has a lot of Native American tribes that we have four that are very healthy and active here, why not research how suffrage has affected the Native American women? There's so many things I could tie that into about human trafficking right now and such victims that we are, but there are 70,000 Native American families right here in Houston. So it's not disconnected to us. Thanks for the consideration. And I'm not a student anymore.
Yeah. Well, but we're still dragging you in. So don't
you kid, so you can do this too. I've lived this history.
Yeah, you can help us. I think that's a fantastic idea. Because for starters, didn't the Native American peoples of the US get their suffrage even after 1920? I think it's in the 50s that they got suffrage. So that's even.
I don't have an answer to that, but I would tell you that living conditions on reservations today, it makes you wonder if there's any suffrage at all.
There you go. Well, yeah. So that's Ms. Weaver is making another point, which is very valid, which is you can do public history projects on anything you care about. So it can be Native Americans, and it doesn't even have to be on suffrage. It can be on a social justice and restorative justice project. So don't feel limited to centennial of the suffrage just because that's our symposium. With apologies to our organizers here, we can rebel and we can expand beyond their topic. Hold it, here's something from Jeremy. Oh yeah, so we are getting some good material in case people want to go there. Yeah, okay, Lisa's got a thought. Okay, Tegan or Tegan, how about the pink tax? Just because a person, a woman, hey, should pay over $40. For someone, a woman buys diapers, male diapers are more expensive. You're kidding, I didn't know that. Wow. Is that historical? Yeah, that sounds like, no, the only problem there with that idea is that it sounds contemporary. So you'd have to come up with a historical angle in order for us to convince our history colleagues to help us out here. You have to get the political science folks to help you with that one. The historians want to know, what is the history of diaper purchase, right? Or diaper, you know, you had to sew them back in the day. So yeah, we have to keep it historical, but that's also a very cool topic. Let's see what else we got. Richard. Oh yeah, the 3 battalion flag. I've actually seen that in Mexico. Yep, they're not giving it back until they get the leg back. I'll tell you that. Good. Okay, Native Americans got fit in 24. Barred them from suffrage. Yeah, I do think that is, until finally there was something in the 50s that said no, it overrode the state's ability to deny them the suffrage, I think. Developed countries attained the suffrage. Colonized women in Puerto Rico. There we go. Danielle, look, she's still brilliant. Getting, what about 35? What about the suffrage of women in U.S. territories? So that is an excellent project. So a student could make a video about that. A studio could make a video and post it. Sanjak could start its own video YouTube channel and start putting up those projects, getting this history out there. Even the history of diapers, if you can track that one down. Okay, good. We're getting some discussion here. Amjad Saleh says, yeah. Now see this, you guys are brilliant for the social justice piece. How do you tie a historical issue into a contemporary injustice? You've got that on lock. So Amjad, I think what you would do is choose your country. If you're, I don't know whose class you're in, but choose the country where women are denied suffrage and do a video on both their attempts to get suffrage and the consequences of their failure to be counted as full citizens and exercise those rights. And then you get your history professor to fact check and grammar check, and then you post that out there, and then you share it with every woman's group in that country. You send them a link to your video, and you share it with every women's group in the United States, every suffrage group. And that's how you get people all over the world to pay attention to your voice, Amjad. So hold on, what else we got here? Brielle Grant video where the women and the family discuss, oh, that is great. Testimonials. So Brielle Grant is proposing an oral history project. What has suffrage meant in your family? What has suffrage meant to you? That would be hugely inspirational. Because, so many women these days don't get in line. They don't get in line to vote. They're so swamped. They've got 3 jobs and they've got full-time school at San Jac, and they've got, diapers to change and surgery next Tuesday. It's hard to get in line until they hear Brielle's video about what it means, until they see the cartoons and the posters that Dr. Mundy shared. Alice Paul, she featured in Dr. Beck Young's presentation. They jammed a tube down her throat. She was on a hunger strike. They jammed a tube. She said, "You're not dying on my watch." Jammed a tube down her throat, whipped up an egg, poured it down the tube. They could have punctured her intestines and she could have died on the spot so that we can vote. So what Brielle is proposing is saying, okay, yeah, that was Alice Paul. What about our women today? What does the vote mean today? Excellent. Douglas. Oh, thank you. Douglas is helping us out on the facts here. All right. So I got 4 minutes. So I'll wrap up, okay? But I can tell Luis, we're hearing from Luis here too. Oh, yes. Okay, Luis is bringing in the military angle. What about also, so Brielle and Luis, you guys figure out who each other are, share your contact information. And Brielle, you could start with Luis's military women. What does the vote mean to you since you put your life on the line for this country. What does that vote mean? Where did you vote? Were you in Afghanistan or Iraq? Where did you vote last? Let's get that story out there. I think that's brilliant. You guys should partner up. Oh my gosh, we got, oh, Ma Ferguson. Yeah, there's my girl coming in with Ma Ferguson. All right. Well, I'm not going to read anymore because then I can't remember what I wanted to conclude with. Y'all ready? So guess what? Tomorrow, while you're still on fire from all these presentations, you're getting ready to hear the keynote address. In fact, this afternoon, after the keynote address, before you forget, before you have diapers and military duty or whatever else, you can quickly write up your research that you've already done for the centennial. And you can post it on the Bullock. You can go to the, Google this, Bullock, Texas State History, Texas Story Project, Bullock Museum, Texas Story Project. And you'll get to a button that says submit your story. So Brielle can submit a story of what suffrage has meant to somebody in Texas. Louise can interview one of those military women, and they can both have these stories published by Monday. And then we need only 7 more for our challenge, right? So ladies and gentlemen, I want you to remember this. If you go to the Bullock Texas State History Museum, official museum of Texas, right next to the state capitol in Austin, they are publishing student research in history. And if you Google Bullock, let me hop in here and give it to you, Bullock, and my name, you'll see a video about my students publishing for the Bullock. So if you go Bullock, Teresa Van Hoy, you'll see faces and voices of history. And that's my project with a Bullock, so that you know how we got involved. Hundreds of my students have published in the official Texas State History Museum. Ladies and gentlemen, when you apply for a job and you're doing your CV, you're doing your vita, your resume, you hyperlink that article right into your CV. People click on that and they say, wow, this kid can write. This kid can research. When you're applying to get into a 4-year school, they say, oh my gosh, this kid has initiative, and they give you funding. So you have no idea the jobs and opportunities that my students have gotten because they can hyperlink YouTube videos, whiteboard animations, publications in the Bullock, media coverage of their projects. And I want that for you. And Luis and Brielle can be published by Monday. They have my email address. Write me. I'll help you out. I'll look it over, see if the grammar's good. And then, Bullock, okay. And then look up Andre Grajeda again. You're not going to believe the history of Texas that he published in there. He published about El Paso, the mayor of El Paso, fumigating Mexicans as they came across the bridge, stripping them naked, and fumigating them with a toxic combo of formaldehyde, gasoline, Zyklon B. Zyklon B. Do you know that El Paso's fumigation of Mexicans with Zyklon B ended up being published in Germany by a Nazi as an example of what they could do to the Jews? El Paso inspired the Nazis. And Andre Grajeda, a little kid in a rinky-dink school at St. Mary's University, tells that story in the official Texas State History Museum. So you get out there and you find your story, and you get your professor to give you credit for this project, and you hyperlink it into your CV so that you can get all the opportunities you deserve. History is sexy. History is beautiful. People want to hear you. Okay? Thank you.
All right, thank you, Dr. Van Noy. And now for our next presenter.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Van Hoy. My name is Jeremy Pettigo. I teach government at San Jacinto College North. I had the honor to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Kimberly Hamlin from the University of Miami, Ohio. If you have any questions, feel free to submit those in the Q&A, and Dr. Hamlin will answer those questions at the end of her presentation. Dr. Hamlin is an award-winning historian, speaker, and writer. Her book, Free Thinker, Sex, Suffrage, An Extraordinary Life of Helen Hamilton Garner, reveals a fascinating story of the fallen woman who reinvented herself and became the most potent factor in congressional passage of the 19th Amendment. Free Thinker received support from the National Endowment for the Humanities, Public Scholar Award, and the Carrie Chapman Catt Prize for Research on Women in Politics. Appointed to the Organization of American Historians Distinguished Lecture Bureau, Hamlin speaks about the history of women, gender, and sex across the country. A regular contributor to the Washington Post, Hamlin's research has also been featured at NPR and CBC Radio, Vice, QZ.com, among other outlets. And she has contributed to several PBS documentaries. Hamlin is currently helping to organize commemorations of the 2020 Suffrage Centennial, and she serves as a historical consultant to the Bearded Lady Project, now on view at the National Museum of Natural History. Hamlin lives in Cincinnati, Ohio, where she co-hosts the Mercantile Library's Women You Should Know book discussion series and teaches at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. So Dr. Hamlin, I'll give the floor to you.
Thank you so much, Jeremy, for that lovely introduction. And thank you, John, for all your work to put this conference together and to keep us going in 2020 in our new virtual format. And I know you've been joined by Andrew and Noberto and Jeremy and so many others, San Jacinto, to make this happen. So my big thanks to all of you. I'm honored to be here today with you, and I've learned so much from the other presenters. And I think that you're going to see a lot of resonance between my presentation and the others that we've heard today. We're going to be thinking about suffrage as a war measure. We're going to be talking about Carrie Chapman Catt and Alice Paul. And we're going to be thinking about burning your papers and how women contribute to public life and why it's sometimes hard for us to tell their stories. So thanks to all. I'm going to speak for 40-ish minutes and then take your questions at the end. So please do contribute with your questions. I'm really excited to discuss this research with you. So if you give me 1 second, I'm going to share my screen. I have some images to show from my research, and then we'll get going. Okay. Jeremy, can you see that okay? Is that coming through all right for everyone? Nod or thumbs up me? Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Yes.
Okay, great. So I'm really excited that the Suffrage Centennial has been doing so much to disrupt what my colleague Lisa Tetrode at Carnegie Mellon has called the myth of Seneca Falls. What is the myth of Seneca Falls? The myth of Seneca Falls is the small sidebar story that you get in your history textbooks, right? That says, the suffrage movement started in 1848 when some people gathered in Seneca Falls and asked for the vote, among other things. Then, 75 short years later, women got the vote. This is the myth of Seneca Falls that we are all too often told, when really the suffrage story is longer. It predates 1848. It includes a vast and diverse array of characters far beyond Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who you see pictured here, far beyond Alice Paul and Carrie Chapman Catt, who we're going to talk about today. And so I'm really excited that there's so much new work coming out centering the contributions of women of color. I'm just highlighting 2 books here to put on your radar, books that have just come out in the past several weeks. Vanguard by Martha Jones, How Black Women Won the Vote, Broke Barriers and Insisted on Equality for All, and Kathleen Cahill's Recasting the Vote, which tells the stories of a variety of women of color and what the vote meant to them and how the vote meant different things depending on a woman's race and ethnicity. So Kathleen Cahill centers African-American women, Native women who, as we were just discussing, were not enfranchised by the 19th Amendment. She tells the story of Latino women and also of Chinese American women. So I'm excited that the centennial is giving us this opportunity, this platform to really nuance and diversify and challenge the myth of Seneca Falls, which to date has really shaped what we know as a nation and in our schools about suffrage history. So, you know, I want to start here again with this myth of Seneca Falls and ask you to think about, how are suffragists depicted in your textbooks or on your state exams, in your state standards? Too often we see images like this, right? Which is, this is the picture of the officers of Nassau, the National American Woman Suffrage Association from 1892. These women are all white, they are all older, they are middle class, they are in these uncomfortable looking dresses, and they look sort of prim and cranky. This is not an image that says, wow, you should study the vibrant, dynamic history of suffrage, right? Which is what I'm going to suggest that the suffrage movement is: vibrant and dynamic, made up with a fascinating array of political geniuses and badasses. Can I say that here at Sanjak? You know, a marvelous array of women who fought in a variety of ways throughout their lifetime. So this picture, which all too often is used to encompass the movement, does not really even begin to scratch the surface. I also want to say that this is linked to larger patterns that we see in women's history, right? Even the fact that we say women's history as if it's somehow separate, as if, you know, women aren't part of this larger American story. What I'm showing here are the images from a 2017 study conducted by the National Museum of Women's History. They conducted this study to see how are women presented in history textbooks and state standards across the country. And what they found in 2017 is that despite decades of pioneering research by people like me and your other panelists today, that we know so much more about women's history, this has not made it into our textbooks and our state standards, which still present women as like a little sidebar to the real history of wars and presidents, right? And our state standards require us to know very few women's names, and the women that are most often required by state standards are those you see in this picture and this picture. And you may also notice that these women are predominantly white, and that in no state in all of America requires students to learn the name of one Asian American woman. So we have so much work to do with our textbooks, with our state standards. So that's one of our themes today, is what would America look like? What would our history look like if we centered these stories of women, if we disrupted this myth of Seneca Falls and women's history more broadly in our textbooks, in our state standards, in our memorials, in our holidays, right? What do the stories that we tell about ourselves as a nation mean in the present? And I'm so passionate about this because I firmly believe that the stories we tell about our past shape what we think is possible in the present and in the future. So today I'm going to disrupt this myth of Seneca Falls by focusing on 3 themes. The first, just to make sure you're all still awake, I know I'm now the thing that stands between you and your lunch. The first thing we're going to talk about is sex. I hope this will keep you awake for a little bit longer. And in particular, my research on Helen Hamilton Garner, the woman I'm going to tell you about today, has really demonstrated to me the importance of sex, and more specifically, the sexual double standard in motivating women to demand the vote. The second theme we're going to talk about today is race, and how racism shapes the trajectory of the 19th Amendment and its legacy. The third theme we're going to talk about today is the one I kind of started with, which is historical memory, how what I consider our collective amnesia with regard to women's contributions to American life hinders women's equality today. I'm going to do this by focusing on the story of Helen Hamilton Garner. So now you may be saying, who is Helen Hamilton Garner? Helen Hamilton Garner is, I think, the most fascinating and important suffragist that no one has ever heard of. Helen Hamilton Garner was a fallen woman. This means that she had sex before marriage and everyone found out about it. So she was the fallen woman. She was born Alice Chenoweth, but after her sex scandal, rather than slink away in shame, which would have been the easy, more common thing to do, she moved to New York City and she reinvented. She changes her name to Helen Hamilton Garner, became one of the best known speakers and writers of the 19th century. And then in the early 1900s, she reinvents once more. She marries a Civil War hero. They settled in Washington, D.C., where she became the suffragist, the NAWSA, the National American Women's Suffrage Association. She became their lead negotiator in Washington, credited with getting the 19th Amendment through Congress and with converting President Woodrow Wilson to the cause. When she died in 1925, she was the highest ranking woman ever in federal government and a national symbol of what it meant for women, white women at least, to finally be full citizens. And yet no one has ever heard of you. So I'm asking you a couple of things here. I'm asking you to think, what does a woman have to do in order to be remembered in America, right? And what would America look like if we centered these stories? I hope that you will leave today's talk thinking to yourself, gosh, I can't believe I've never heard of Helen Hamilton Garner. Who else have I never heard of? I first met Helen Hamilton Garner when I was working on my dissertation at the University of Texas at Austin. I know there's got to be some Longhorns on this call, so I'm going to hook them with you. I first encountered her on my research project for my dissertation, where I was looking at how 19th century women used science for feminist purposes to advance their claims about equality. And that's where I first met Helen Hamilton Garner, because one very interesting chapter in her life that we're not going to talk that much about today has to do with her efforts to disprove the common theory in the 19th century that women's brains were naturally inferior to men, and that this was why women shouldn't be allowed to go to college, to have careers, to enter public life. So Garner took on the leading scientists of the day and publicly challenged and disputed their research. And then as like a final ta-da, she donated her own brain to science when she died in 1925. This is what you see pictured here. And she did this because she wanted scientists for the first time to study the brain of an educated woman. In her lifetime, scientists made all these claims about male brains versus female brains by comparing the brains of eminent men, leading scientists, thinkers, politicians against women who died in insane asylums, prison, or homeless. So she was basically saying, even if there were differences between brains, how are we going to know from comparing apples to oranges, right? So she donates her own brain in the hopes of proving the intellectual equality of women. Her brain remains on display in a display case outside the psychology department at Cornell, floating in formaldehyde in this glass jar. But she did sort of win in her day, where her brain bequest was given huge national coverage, many New York Times front page headlines, including this one, "Woman's Brain Not Inferior to Men's." So this is how I first met Helen Hamilton Garner, who I call HHG for short. So when I say HHG, I'm saying Helen Hamilton Garner. This is how I first met her. And I was so fascinated with her boldness, right? What gave her the nerve as a young woman, not formally trained in science, to take on the leading brain scientist of the day? What made her so bold? I wanted to know. So I kept looking around and researching her for a few years, seeing what I could find and if there was going to be enough material to write her biography. And when I saw this letter hidden in another woman's collection at the Library of Congress, written in code and without Helen Hamilton Garner's name actually on it, I knew I would tell her story. Why? How did I know this? Well, can you see in handwriting at the top left, this was HHG's handwriting, as I immediately recognized. And she writes, best destroy this letter. Underline, underline, underline. In this 3-page typewritten letter to her best friend, Mary Phillips, who she calls Little Phil here, she outlines her scandalous personal life that she had kept secret her whole entire life because it threatened to upend her hard-won professional successes and national acclaim. But she outlines it here in this secret coded letter. And then I knew I would tell her story. It's not often you find a secret coded letter in the archives, right? The historians I know are nodding along. Yes, right. This is a wonderful find. And she details the secret aspects of her life, the sex scandal, in her 25 years of living with a man who she told everyone was her husband, except that he was totally not her husband. So this, I thought, warrants additional research, and now I know I can tell her story. So this brings us to the theme of sex, right? Our number one theme today. This is a picture of HHG as a young girl. She's here on the left. She's just 2. Again, her birth name is Alice Chenoweth. She was born in 1853 in Winchester, Virginia. She was the youngest of 7 children born to a circuit riding, meaning he traveled around, a circuit riding Methodist preacher who also happened to be from a first family of Virginia, a wealthy patriarchal family that owned many slaves. By the time Alice Chenoweth was born, her father could no longer abide this contradiction of being a Methodist minister on the one hand and a person who owned other human beings on the other. So when young Alice was just 1, her father moves everyone to Washington, D.C., where he could emancipate the people that the family held in bondage. The following year, he moves everyone to Greencastle, Indiana, in the hopes of avoiding the coming sectional crisis, which would be the Civil War, and raising his children away from the taint of slavery. This is not to be. Of course, the Civil War impacts every inch of the country. And for the Chenoweth family in particular, they lose everything. So Gardner's father, the minister, gets invited by President Lincoln himself, and by invited, I mean demanded, to serve as a scout for Union troops in Virginia. Union troops didn't know their way around Virginia at all, and they were getting massively beaten in the early years of the war because they didn't know how to navigate. So President Lincoln calls on her father because who would know the back roads and valleys and hills and trails of Virginia better than a circuit riding minister who had traversed them for decades. So Gardner's father serves the Union along with all 3 of her brothers. This obviously does not endear them to their Virginia friends and relatives. This sets them apart. They lose contact. They, kind of have a big division in their family. But this imprints upon young Alice Chenoweth that the thing to do in life is sacrifice everything for your beliefs, no matter the cost. And this is the lesson she takes from this. Also, her family loses everything during the Civil War. The men all die, they sell their home, they sell their farms. So Alice Chenoweth grows up kind of shuffling around between different relatives. And she decides that rather than pursue early marriage and early motherhood, which is what her older sisters did, that she's going to go to school and become a teacher, which is basically the only acceptable thing or way for a middle-class woman to support herself in the 19th century. So young Alice Chenoweth moves to Cincinnati to attend Cincinnati Normal School and become a teacher. By the age of 22, she's the youngest school principal in Ohio. She's living now in a town called Sandusky in the north of Ohio, and she's so proud of this accomplishment. She's supporting herself. She's a school principal. She's doing a great job. She gets written up in the newspapers. She's very pleased. For the rest of her life, she cites these accomplishments. But you can see she's also very beautiful. Her skill in the classroom brings her to the attention of the Ohio Commissioner of Public Schools, a man whose name is Charles Smart. He's 15 years older. He's also a married father of 2. Now, young Alice Chenoweth has the misfortune of boarding in this house here, the Widow Melville's boarding house, this is its current owners, but the house is still basically the same. Alice Chenoweth boards in this house alongside the brother and sister-in-law of the guy who edits the Sandusky daily paper. So soon rumors start circulating. Why is School Commissioner Smart constantly in our town? Sandusky is not the capital of Ohio. Sandusky doesn't have the biggest school system in Ohio. Soon it comes to light, largely through the people that HHG lives with here, that Commissioner Smart is constantly in Sandusky to visit the young school principal. Soon, the newspapers begin reporting this. Soon, young Alice Chenoweth is forced to resign her hard-earned job, which is, again, basically the only job she could have, and she's run out of town in disgrace. Within a few months, papers across the entire state of Ohio are writing about this affair because young Alice Chenoweth is having an affair with an elected official. Some papers even print her name, as you can see here. So now, not only is Alice Chenoweth a fallen woman, everyone knows about it, right? This would normally be the end of her life. But there's something inside her that says, no, not today, not for me. Instead, this is the moment that begins her activism. She spends the next several years thinking, writing, questioning. Why is it, she wants to know, that men and women are held to such different standards when it comes to sex? Commissioner Smart had told her that he was divorced. He lied, and she believed him. She fell in love with him. Once the truth came to light, it didn't matter, right? She was still a fallen woman run out of town, while Commissioner Smart carries on in his job, carries on in his marriage as if it's no problem. And she wants to know, how did this come to be, right? Why is a woman's virginity considered her most valuable asset? And why does no one remotely think about a man's virginity? So these are the questions that animate her thoughts, that prompt her research over the next several years. So she kind of goes into exile, like a self-imposed exile for several years, reading, thinking, writing, reflecting. And then she reemerges in New York City in 1883 with a new name. Now she calls herself Helen Hamilton Garner. And in the 19th century, decades before the internet and Google, you could do this. You could move to a new city, change your name, and distance yourself from your scandalous past, which is precisely what she does. She enters the public life on the free thought, what today we would call atheist or agnostic, lecture circuit, because in all of her reading and thinking, she's decided that the root cause of the sexual double standard and the root cause of women's second-class status in life are the stories in the Bible. She thinks that's where we get these ideas that women are naturally inferior and that we should hold them to different standards when it comes to sex. So she begins giving these bold speeches throughout the country on this topic, and she is bolstered in these efforts by her mentor, a man named Robert Ingersoll, who was the most popular speaker on the 19th century lecture circuit. He would draw crowds of 10,000 or more to hear him talk. And Gardner had befriended him. So he traveled to New York City to introduce her first lecture. He wrote the introduction to her first book. This guarantees Gardner, a young woman that no one has ever heard of before, crowds and press coverage that no other speaker or writer could possibly expect, right? So this puts her on the map. She starts giving her lectures throughout the East Coast, up and down the East Coast, as far west as Chicago, and she's getting national news coverage for these bold speeches and for being willing to attack organized religion. She's also making her name for herself by being so witty and charming, and she uses her femininity, her beauty, her charm, her humor to sort of help make acceptable her radical ideas, right? She dresses them up in a pretty feminine package, which enables people to hear them more. So soon she's writing books, which go into many, many editions. This is her first book, Men, Women, and Gods. She ultimately writes 7 books and becomes not just one of the most popular speakers of the 19th century, but also one of the most popular writers. By 1893, she is one of the best known women in America. At the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago, Gardner gives more speeches than any other American woman. The New York Sun reports that next to Susan B. Anthony, HHG created the profoundest sensation. Some eyewitnesses who were there reported that any room where Garner spoke was filled to capacity, with police guarding the doors to prevent overcrowding. One woman even recalled some desperate women trying to bribe the police officers to get into the rooms where Garner was speaking. This is how popular she was. This is how popular her bold speaking was about sex, about religion, and the sexual double standard. In the early 1890s, shortly after the World's Fair, she hones in on what's going to be her signature cause of the 19th century, and the place where she learns all of her lessons about politics, about lobbying, about negotiating. And this issue is raising the age of sexual consent for girls. So I want you to listen closely here, because you're going to think that you misheard me. In 1890, the age at which a girl was considered legally capable of consenting to sex with a grown man was 12 or younger in 38 states. It was generally 12 or 10. In Delaware, it was 7. This means grown men could and did have sex with 10-year-old girls and avoid prosecution by saying, she consented. Now for Garner, this issue really encapsulates everything that's wrong with the sexual double standard, right? The women who lose their virginity by force or coercion at these early ages tend to be shunned, tend to be drawn into lives of prostitution or economic uncertainty, violence. Now, no one knows that Garner herself is a fallen woman, but this is why she takes on this cause. She wants to draw public sympathy, empathy towards fallen women. She wants to change the script, and she wants to arouse a complacent public to action. So she turns to fiction, and she writes these 2 novels that tell from the perspective of young women what it's like to be seduced and what limited choices women have, right? So for these novels, she becomes known as the Harriet Beecher Stowe of fallen women for trying to rouse a public to action through fiction. In 1895, she moves to Boston. This is HHG at the top of this circle of pictures, to edit a magazine called The Arena, which is a popular reform magazine. And she turns The Arena into basically a single issue publication with the goal of raising the age of sexual consent to 18 in every state. In this effort, she joins forces with some unlikely allies. Unlikely for her, that is, namely the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Garner, as we've just covered, is definitely not a Christian, nor does she support temperance, but it's the women of the WCTU who have been leading this effort to raise the age of sexual consent. So Garner joins forces with them because, as Frances Willard proclaimed, the Siamese twins of vice are strong drink in the degradation of women. So temperance workers believed that if you curbed one of these vices, you would go a long way to curbing the other. Garner and her allies in the temperance movement campaign, lobby energetically, ferociously for years to raise the age of sexual consent. And what they learn in these efforts is that women need the vote. Now, Frances Willard had supported suffrage, but most of her 200,000 temperance members were not really suffragists in the 1880s and 1890s. They believed the fiction that men voted for women, that women didn't need the vote because their husbands and their fathers voted with their best interest at heart. But these age of consent reforms gave lie to that. The women could not believe how hard it was to get male state legislators to change these laws. Male state legislators rebuffed them, ignored them, made fun of them, inserted mocking language if and when age of consent reforms ever did come up. So this is what proves to the 200,000 plus temperance women that women needed the vote, that men are not advocating on behalf of everyone. A few things really drive this point home. One is the example of Carrie Holley. Women soon make the connection that the only states that raise the age of consent all the way to 18 are the states in which women have at least partial suffrage, meaning they can vote in some elections. Those are Kansas, Wyoming, and after 1893, Colorado. These are the states that raised the age of consent to 18. And Carrie Hawley was elected to the Colorado State Legislature as one of 3 women elected the year after women were enfranchised in that state. Carrie Hawley also has the distinction of introducing the very first piece of legislation ever proposed by a female elected legislator in the United States. Can you guess what it was? Of course you can, right? Raising the age of sexual consent. So Hawley's bill passes, the age of consent in Colorado is raised to 18. Suffragists, temperance workers hold up this example as proof positive that women need the vote and a seat at the table, right? This is what happens when women can vote. Women can protect their bodies. Women can hope to attain bodily autonomy. So this is the sex portion of today's talk. I really want to center that in terms of what motivated women to demand the vote: bodily autonomy and the sexual double standard. This is where Garner learns politics. This is what convinces 200,000 temperance advocates to become ardent suffragists. Theme 2 of today is race and how racism shapes the trajectory of the 19th Amendment, which we can really see through Gardner's negotiations with men in Congress. As I mentioned in my introductory remarks, Garner reinvents once more. She doesn't change her name again, but she does sort of reinvent in the early 1900s. She had lived for 25 years with Charles Smart and told everyone that he was her husband, which he never was, and he dies in 1901. Then she suffers a big breakdown and she kind of recuperates by marrying this guy, Colonel Selden Day, who was a Union Civil War hero, but who also had many friends among Confederates because he was tasked with guarding the cell of Confederate President Jefferson Davis at Fort Monroe, and he was nice to Jefferson Davis. So Jefferson Davis's widow wrote about this in her memoir. Why do we care about this? Well, because when Garner and Day moved to Washington, D.C. in 1910, who was in charge of everything? Former Confederates, their sons and nephews. Southern Democrats, which mostly this time meant Southern Democrats, took control of both houses of Congress and the White House in the 1912 elections. Colonel Selden Day's address book is chock full of his Civil War friends, Union and Confederate, Northern and Southern. This is who's in charge in Washington. So Gardner has entree to the seats of power that suffragists had never had before. This helps her endear her to suffragists. She had never been a member of Nassau before. Gardner was best friends with Elizabeth Cady Stanton from their time together on the Free Thought Lecture Circuit. And so she would occasionally speak at Nassau meetings when Stanton invited her, but she was never a suffragist until 1910, when she moves to DC and quickly establishes herself as Nassau's most efficient volunteer, in part because of her vast connections, her personal charms, which were legendary, and in part because of her house, which is next door to the Speaker of the House of Representatives, if you can believe this. So if you see here, their porches are adjacent. So Gardner would do things like put on her hat and gloves, wait inside of her door, and listen for Representative Champ Clark's door to close. Then she would appear on her porch as if by coincidence and say, "Oh, hey, Speaker Clark, how's it going? Would you like a peach muffin? By the way, how is our amendment coming along in the House? Where are we on these votes? And how do we have our committee yet on women's suffrage?" So she used this informal diplomacy brilliantly for the suffragist cause, which we could talk more about in questions. Another way she really advanced the suffrage cause is she was Alice Paul's right-hand woman in preparing and organizing the 1913 suffrage parade. This is Gardner and Alice Paul together in the makeshift Nassau headquarters, organizing the parade together day in and day out. Gardner was in charge of the press operations, and she succeeded in guaranteeing positive national press coverage for suffrage for the very first time. So that was a huge victory. She also used her DC contacts and her personal charms to arrange all of the necessary permissions, which was no small feat and took weeks and weeks and was very tenuous right up until the day of the parade that it would actually happen. But she succeeded in attaining all the necessary permissions for the women to march from the Capitol to the White House down Pennsylvania Avenue. This is the beautiful suffrage booklet. And this also, I just, on a side note, before there was a question about the colors, and I tried to answer it in the chat, but I think maybe I did it wrong. So I wanted to answer it again here. This was the colors were a highly contentious element of the parade. Alice Paul suggested purple and green, which were the British suffrage colors, but Nassau said no, 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 because they didn't want to be too closely aligned with the radicalism of the British movement. So the compromise position was yellow or gold, as you can see, and purple. And there was this 1913 suffrage parade that really cements purple, yellow, and white as the suffrage colors, but it was very controversial, and you can't believe the amount of ink that was spilled back and forth between Alice Paul and Nassau headquarters over the selection of colors, a very hot topic. So that was a side note, but what I want to really introduce here is in this parade is this is where we also see the theme of race come to the fore. So Gardner and Alice Paul did not want Black women to march alongside white women in this DC parade. Black women had marched alongside white women in some other suffrage parades in Boston and New York. But as Gardner wrote to the suffrage magazine, the Woman's Journal, she said, DC is not Boston. DC is not New York. DC is a Southern city, she said. And if we want to get the 19th Amendment through Congress, we're going to need some Southern support because you need 2/3 votes. And if we want to get this ratified, we're going to need some Southern support. So Gardner starts here articulating, not Gardner alone, but Gardner and many of the white suffrage leaders start articulating here this devil's compromise, which we're going to focus on here for the next few minutes, of getting the 19th Amendment through Congress and basically ignoring the rights of Black women to vote. This begins to be kind of prominent in this 1913 parade. Black women did ultimately march in the parade alongside white women, but it's not because Alice Paul wanted them to. Alice Paul cold-shouldered them. She ignored their requests. She blew them off. Nassau headquarters frantically telegrammed Alice Paul saying, "We're getting word that you're not being welcoming to Black women. You cannot do that. That is antithetical to everything we as Nassau want. If we are for the vote of one woman, we are for the vote of all women." But Alice Paul ignored that directive and cold-shouldered the African-American women who approached her about participating. Ultimately, dozens of African-American women did participate, but again, not because Alice Paul made it easy for them to do so. After this parade, Alice Paul and HHG become bitter rivals. They soon hate each other. And this rivalry shapes the trajectory of the 19th Amendment. They are essentially fighting over who is going to be the suffragist lead negotiator in Washington. First, they work well together, but Helen Hamilton Gardner begins to deeply resent the militarism, the protest tactics that Alice Paul wants to bring to the movement. This is not how Helen Hamilton Gardner and Nassau want to do things. This really comes to the fore, and we can see this here in 1916. This is the first time that Gardner reaches out to the Wilson White House. She's returned from California, and she's learned that Alice Paul and her National Woman's Party have started heckling the president at his public appearances. So she writes to Wilson's chief of staff and she says, "Hey, I want you to know that Alice Paul does not speak for all suffragists." She says, "The real suffragists are me and my friends in Nassau. We are nonpartisan. We will never heckle you. You want to work with us." Then she attaches this handwritten postscript saying, "Hey, is there ever a day where Mrs. Wilson wants or could meets with visitors? I would love to call on her." So guess who goes to the White House the very next day? HHG. No one had thought to reach out to Mrs. Wilson before. So from this letter through all of Wilson's second term, Gardner is a welcome daily presence at the White House. To this same letter, she also attaches a typewritten memo elucidating the differences between Nassau, her group, and Alice Paul's group. Now, what really struck me here is that Wilson's been president for 3 years. He still has no idea who's who among the suffragists. He doesn't know their names. He doesn't know there's two groups. So a few weeks later, Carrie Chapman Catt reaches out to Wilson and says, oh, I'd like to arrange a meeting. And he goes to Tumulty and he says, who are these ladies? Are they the hecklers? And Tumulty says, oh, well, here's this easy to read typewritten memo I have from this nice lady, Helen Hamilton Gardner. So Wilson says, okay, 2 p.m. So it's because of Gardner's clever diplomacy that Nassau becomes a welcome daily presence, and through Gardner. Even Carrie Chapman Catt does not go through the White House without first approaching Gardner. And here you can see Wilson's own writing saying, are these ladies of the Congressional Union variety? And then when he learns they're not, he says, okay, I'll meet with them. And this really was striking to me. So it's Gardner's use of her antipathy towards Alice Paul and Wilson's antipathy to Alice Paul that gets Nassau in the door. Gardner and Carrie Chapman Catt become regular emissaries. Again, mostly Gardner. Even Carrie Chapman Catt doesn't go to the White House without first going through Gardner. Gardner later brags that she had asked Wilson for 22 favors and he immediately granted 21. All the while, Alice Paul is outside protesting, not realizing that HHG is inside. Now, after Gardner successfully converts Wilson to an ally and creates the House Committee on Women's Suffrage, the House first votes yes on the 19th Amendment in January 1918. The amendment then goes to the Senate, and this is where we see race come to the fore. We've heard about the suffrage as a war measure argument, which certainly persuaded the general public and to some extent Wilson that women needed the vote, but in terms of persuading the Senate, it did not. So Wilson goes to the Senate in September of 1918 to give a impassioned plea, the best articulation of the suffrage as a war measure vote. It did not change a single mind. Immediately after Wilson leaves the Capitol, senators take to the podium, and what do they talk about? Race. So what I want to stress here is that by the time the 19th Amendment finally comes before Congress, the main objection, and in many cases, the only objection to the 19th Amendment is Black women voting in the South. You see this over and over again in Gardner's correspondence and in the floor statements of senators themselves. I'm just going to give you one example here, which is Gardner's correspondence with John Sharp Williams. Suffragists knew they needed at least 2 more votes in the Senate, and they thought they might have a chance with John Sharp Williams because he was known as the most erudite man in the Senate and because he was close friends with Gardner. So immediately after the House first passes it, she writes to John Sharp Williams and she says, oh, hey, John Sharp Williams, it was great to celebrate my birthday together with you and your wife, reminding them of their close friendship. Then she lays into him and she said, in the House, the entire Mississippi delegation voted no. I want you to redeem that state, she says. I know you know that the suffrage is coming for women. Why not be on the right side of history? Why not make your grandchildren proud? Why not make democracy ring true for all? She writes in this impassioned, beautiful 3-page letter. He writes her back the very next day and says, dear Helen, if anything in the world could get me to do the thing you wanted, it would be your letter. But he says, I will never vote for the 19th Amendment because I will never vote to enfranchise the Black women of Mississippi. He said, if I lived in any white state, a state where the white population dominated over the Black in terms of numbers, he said, sure, fine, I would vote for it, but not in Mississippi. He said, Black women will most certainly go to the polls while white women will stay home. And he says, furthermore, the real reason that Black men don't vote in Mississippi is not because of the various legal bars we've erected, like poll taxes and literacy tests. The real reason Black men don't vote is because they know if they do, they will get hurt. And then he goes on to say, but we can't use violence against Black women to scare them from the polls because they're women after all. So this letter really shocked me. And once I saw these arguments, I saw them again and again and again in floor statements and in other correspondence, not just from Southern Democrats, but from opponents from both parties in all regions. When the suffrage amendment finally did pass the Senate in June of 1919, again, if you had been a fly on the wall, you'd be very confused because the amendment that everyone is talking about is not the 19th, but the 15th. The amendment that technically on paper extended the franchise to Black men, but had never been enforced since 1877. So senators feared not only that Black women in the South would be able to vote, but also that the 19th Amendment would somehow compel the federal government to enforce the 15th and let Black men vote too. This is the predominant argument that stands out, as you can see here in some of these quotes. And I want to highlight the one from Senator Marcus Aurelius Jones. He was a supporter of suffrage, and in fact, he was chair of the Women's Suffrage Committee. But he, like Carrie Chapman Catt and the white suffrage leaders, are signaling to the South that they don't care about the 15th Amendment. They're basically saying, let us pass the 19th, and then you can keep disenfranchising Black women in the South the exact same way that you've been disenfranchising Black men since 1877, and we won't say a peep about it. So the thing to keep in mind here is that the 19th Amendment finally passes Congress, not because anyone thinks it will enfranchise Black women in the South, but because everyone knows it won't. This is a picture of Garner at the signing ceremony, which she arranged. It's the first public signing ceremony of its kind. Garner is really a press genius. She arranges the signing ceremony. She invites the media, including motion pictures. She even buys the fancy gold pen. But this legacy of disenfranchisement is with us to this day, right? This devil's bargain that the white suffragists made. And they did not do anything to make sure the 19th Amendment was enforced in the early years after its ratification. They basically said to the Black women who approached them saying, we still can't vote in the South. The white leaders said, that's not our issue. That's a race issue. You're on your own to get the 19th Amendment upheld and enforced. Now, the final few things I want to say return us to this theme of memory. Whose stories do we remember? Whose names do we remember? And whose do we forget? As I mentioned, Gardner in 1920, even before the 19th Amendment is ratified, Wilson appoints her to the Civil Service Commission, which was a big, just a big high-ranking job just under cabinet secretary. This makes her the highest-ranking woman ever in federal government. She's on front pages of newspapers across the country. And this is a really symbolic position, right? It's designed to show, aha, women are finally part of the government. And Gardner gets this plum post, right? But we've never heard of her. And she devotes the last few years of her life to trying to shore up the memory of suffragists. She bought this fancy gold pen for the 19th Amendment signing ceremony, in part for news coverage, but more for memory. So just days after the signing ceremony, it was the Congressional signing ceremony, she reaches out to the Smithsonian and she says, hey, I have all these suffrage relics from the Nassau, DC headquarters. We've got Susan B. Anthony's red shawl, we've got important books and letters, and we have this gold pen used to sign the 19th Amendment before sending it to the states for ratification. Hey, Smithsonian, it's time you put together a really important exhibition on women's rights and women's contributions to American history. She tries to lobby them to get this exhibit up and running. The Smithsonian does ultimately create it, but they put it in a little tiny stairwell and call the exhibit an important epic in American history. This is not what Gardner had in mind. This is not the sort of sweeping changes to American narratives she and her suffrage colleagues had in mind. But nevertheless, this small hallway exhibit at the Smithsonian remained the nation's only testimony pretty much to suffrage for about 100 years. So I ask you, whose stories do we remember? And I'm going to end here with this picture of Gardner. She's riding her beloved white Andalusian pony, Caillou, through the streets of Washington, which she loved to do. And she's posing here in front of one of the dozens of statues to Civil War heroes that she watched being erected during her lifetime. She also watched the Lincoln Memorial from the windows of her civil service office. And I think she's saying here, where's my statue? When will we tell the stories of women's contributions to American life? And what would America look like if we did? Thank you so much for having me here today. I look forward to your questions and comments.
Okay, Dr. Hammond, we do have one question. We actually have a couple of questions. I think we're in the chat, but there is one in the Q&A.
There's what?
There's a question in the Q&A section. Do you see Q&A?
About the Grimke sisters? Oh, I'm in the chat. Okay, let me go to Q&A.
Okay.
Yes. Oh my gosh. Amjad, I hear you. So the question is, the sexual double standard is sadly still evident. I think sometimes people ask me, what would HHG think about 2020? And this is often what I say, right? I think in some ways she would be excited by some of the progress that women have made, right? But I think she would be shocked to see how ingrained the sexual double standard still is, how we view our female candidates, how we view our female leaders, the way in which we evaluate them, not just in terms of sex, but also in terms of their looks. So Gardner, one funny thing I sometimes read when I give these talks is when Gardner was first on the lecture circuit, many of the early reviews of her talks said nothing about what she said and everything about how she looked. So she wrote this funny spoof called Review of the New Male Star, where she wrote about, what would this look like if we did this to men? And so she was really ahead of her time, right? She was writing this in 1886, and that's still the case, right? I mean, how many, did we see any articles about what Biden wore last night, or how he looked, or Trump's hair, or if they're likable? No, that's not how we talk about male leaders. So, and also the sexual double standard is so alive and well. And this semester I'm teaching a new class that for the first time, I've just devised it, and it's called Me Too, A Cultural History. And it's honestly probably my most favorite and best class I've ever taught, even though it's super depressing, because what we see and what we're studying is how much the sexual double standard still shapes our lives, our opportunities, and our daily movements. Other questions?
Yeah, there was a question from actually one of our panelists, Doug Simmons, history professor, about did the Grimke sisters have an impact on her thinking?
I never saw her writing or thinking about the Grimke sisters, though, of course, the Grimke sisters had such an impact on women's rights as a whole. And I think that's another way that we should disrupt the myth of Seneca Falls, is by, moving the deadline, or not the deadline, the origins earlier to the 1830s, and really situate the origins of the suffrage movement in the abolition movement. And I think the Grimke sisters help us do that and remind us that suffragists at first did not want the 19th Amendment. What they wanted was universal suffrage. What they wanted was the Constitution to declare that citizenship equals voting rights. So we still don't have that, right? What we have are various laws saying you can't discriminate based on race, you can't discriminate based on sex, but you can discriminate based on all these other things. And what I hope the suffrage centennial will do, among other things, is inspire us to demand new legislation that says citizenship equals voting rights, to extend the suffrage universally, to remove all the barriers to voting that we have in so many of our states.
I actually have a question. Do you think someone who teaches government, I'm always looking at the politics of it, do you think she mainly joined the NAWSA for political reasons? Did she realize that was the most effective path to get suffrage enacted?
Yes, I also think it was personal for her. So after Gardner married that guy, Selden Day, the Civil War hero, they traveled the world for 5 years. So when she lived in New York. When she left New York in 1901, she was one of the most famous women in America. When she moves to DC and buys that house in 1910, everyone's forgotten about her. So she starts meeting with these younger suffragists, and no one even remembers, what she did or said or how bold she had been. So I think she's also like looking for a new home. She needs a movement. She tries various things, and she wants to be active. She wants to contribute. So the suffrage women are kind of in her social circle, and she sees a place where she can contribute. And she likes Nassau more than NWP, because even though she's a firebrand and a radical intellectually, she does so through writing charming letters. She doesn't want to go heckle the president. She doesn't want to protest at the White House. She wants to send him apricots from her garden, which she did. She wants to charm him by having tea with Mrs. Wilson. So it's partly ideological and partly social and personal. But she very much did believe in the Nassau strategies. She loved Carrie Chapman Catt. They were close friends, and she helped Carrie Chapman Catt come up with the winning plan. She was the one who told Carrie Chapman Catt, we need to move a NASA headquarters to DC. You know, we really need to focus our personnel here in the nation's capital. So for all of those reasons, she joined NASA.
Dr. Hamlin, I want to thank you for your excellent presentation. And I'm going to pass the baton to John Gillespie, history professor. He's going to have closing remarks.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Hamlin, so much for that presentation. That was very informative. That was wonderful. And thank you once again to all of our presenters for attending and for your presentations. History Matters has always taken pride in featuring the best in scholarship from our Houston area colleges and universities and beyond. And so several people that I need to thank and shout out. I want to thank Professor Darla Rocha, the chair of Behavioral and Social Sciences. We need to thank the North Campus Provost Office and of course our Chancellor for her support and her presentation this morning. And also our partners at W.W. Norton, without whom we could not have made this possible. Also, the History Matters 2020 Organizing Committee, Andrew Chow, Holly Mulholland, Jeremy Pedigo, and Doug Simmons. Thank you guys for your patience, your flexibility, and hard work. They had to do this twice. we were all ready to go last, I think it was maybe last February, had our last meeting and said, okay, we're ready to do this. And then COVID hit. And so we're disappointed, but of course, happy that we were able to do this safely in a way that everybody can participate. So also, I want to thank our San Jacinto College student body and guests, many of whom have supported History Matters for years. Of course, Danielle Bible and the Women's History Month grant for their cooperation and support. And so in just a few minutes, I'm going to step down after 5 years of chair of the committee, and we're going to hand the baton to Chair-elect Professor Pedigo. And yeah, he gets to do this in a non-COVID year. You know, I'm sure that's it's going to be really easy for Jeremy, right? And but I want to thank or wish everybody a safe and happy 2020. And we look forward to seeing you again and hopefully in person for History Matters 2021. Before you sign off, I'm going to share my screen and give you the QR code for the survey, so that we know what went well and what didn't go well and what we can do better. And you know, if there's anything else that you think we need to do to make this more accessible to people or anything like that. So before I do that, would any members of the committee like to say, you know, you forgot something or jump in there?
I actually like to thank tech support.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jeremy.
Norberto Valadares,
Norberto.
tech support. Norberto spent countless time, emails, training to get us set up. If it wasn't for Norberto, it wouldn't have led to such a successful event today. So I want to thank tech support for their help.
Yes, absolutely. Good catch, Jeremy. Tech support, Norberto, thank you for being with us and walking us through. You've been a great help. Okay, so I'm going to let everybody leave at their leisure, and I wish we were all, you know, the committee and everybody was going to meet for lunch, but next year, I hope. So I'm going to put up the QR code, and you can just raise your phones to it. We tried it last night, and it worked. Thank you for your support on the survey, and we hope to see you all again next. Okay, I hope you can see my QR code.
I think I just got bumped out of my thing right at step 8. So I'll email you guys just to back up in case. Bye.
Thank you.